The Gallant, Star Legend Book 3, written and narrated by J.J. Green, with help from Welsh language consultant Mike Paddock. Chapter 23. Despite the challenges waiting at the end of their journey, Taylan was enjoying her time with Angharad's sons. Their long treks under the stars or through cloudy, wet nights didn't hurt her leg too much, and she had plenty of time to recover during the day while they rested and slept. At that time of year the nights were short and the days long. In order to reach their destination by Midsummer's Eve, they had to leave an hour before sunset and halt an hour after sunrise. The potential exposure to unwanted observers was risky, but they had no choice. After the sun rose, they would pick up pieces of fallen dry wood until it was time to stop. By then, they usually had enough to build a hot, fast-burning fire that produced little smoke. The men would take turns in making cakes of stiff dough out of flour, oats, baking powder, salt and water, which they cooked on stones placed on the edge of the fire. For some reason, Taylan was never asked to take a turn. They also foraged for food during the daylight hours to help eke out their rations, though little was available at that time of year. They picked honeysuckle flowers in woods, sucking out their sweet nectar. When they reached the coast, they ate the sea kale growing in the shingle. A kind of tea made from elderflowers relieved the monotony of drinking plain water. 16 hours of daylight every day as the summer solstice approached was far too much time to spend sleeping. After waking, they would huddle in whatever shelter they'd managed to find and discuss plans to disrupt the festival the Crusaders were about to hold at Bryn Celli D on Ynys Môn. The tomb was so old no one knew who had built it. As the sun rose on midsummer morning, it would shine down the tomb's central passage and light up the interior, marking the beginning of the EAC's biggest annual celebration. Huge numbers of the Dwyr's followers would be gathered and out of their minds on alcohol and hallucinogens. It would be the perfect opportunity to do the movement some real damage. One late afternoon, after they'd woken up and eaten and were waiting to set off for another night's walk, talk of sabotaging the Midsummer Festival had run dry. Mark said, "Taylan, is it true the men who were with you when you first came to the Preseli Hills, not the Marines, the other ones, is it true they were King Arthur and Merlin?" Before she could answer, Medwyn broke in, "I never heard such nonsense in all my life. Of course it's not true. 2 wanderers who stole a sword and chainmail from a museum, that's all they were." "Shut up," Mark told his brother. "I asked Taylan, not you." The young man's eyes were shining with excitement. Taylan knew how he felt. She had been just as excited when she realised King Arthur had returned to save the BI, exactly as the legend promised, and it had happened in her lifetime. But Mark hadn't seen the savage trail of destruction Arthur had left in the crowd of Dwyr Orr's followers at the harbour not so long ago. Her opinion of the ancient king had changed that day. She would never see him in the same way again. "It is true," she replied, though flatly. "Bah!" Medwyn said in disgust. "I didn't see Arthur when Major Wright found him, but I did see pictures of him taken soon after he was rescued, and I saw him when he'd transformed to how he is now. It's the same person, and his recovery was miraculous." "What about Merlin?" asked Mark. "Was he found at the same time?" "No, Merlin arrived later." How much should she tell him? Would it be useful or helpful for Mark and the others to know Merlin was an alien who had arrived from outer space? Medwyn wouldn't believe her anyway. "It's a very complicated, long story," she said. "But there's no doubt in my mind they are who they say they are." "If that's so," said Medwin, "why are we going to all this effort? Why not leave everything to the old heroes?" "Because we aren't babies lying in cradles," Mylir replied, "sucking our thumbs while others do the hard work of freeing our country from its invaders." "What are they doing now?" asked Mark. "Are they working to defeat the EAC? Will they be coming back?" "I'm sorry, I don't know what they're doing. All I know is they were planning on returning to the space fleet." "With the Dwyr in space too," said Madog. "Maybe they're trying to attack her up there." Maybe. The conversation had reminded Taylan of Major Wright. She hoped he was okay and that Brigadier Colburn was being less of a bitch than usual. "Did you speak to Arthur or Merlin much?" Mark asked. "Did they tell you about the olden times?" "Arthur did tell me some stories," she replied, "and he talked about what life was like then. Merlin didn't really talk to anyone except Arthur, and when they spoke, they used the language of that time." "Old Welsh?" Madog sounded interested. "Couldn't you understand it?" "No, it sounded familiar, but I couldn't understand a word. It's nice to speak Welsh with all of you, though." She was growing uncomfortable with the conversation. She didn't like to think about Arthur. At the mention of his name, in her mind's eye she saw him sweeping through the crowd of crusaders, a juggernaut of death and destruction, or she saw him leaning on his reddened sword at the foot of Dwyr Orr's platform, covered head to toe in blood and gore. That was the reality of Arthur's time, she realised. Not the romantic tales of knights jousting at tournaments and rescuing fair maidens from tall towers. It had been a terrible time, a time of war, battles, and thousands of men dying in agony. And when the battles were over, peasants would search the bodies for things to steal. Then rats and crows would move in to feast on them. She shivered and checked the position of the sun. "Shouldn't we be leaving soon?" she suggested. "Yes, you're right," said Mylir. "Pack up, everyone." "Maybe you could tell us some of Arthur's stories while we walk," Mark suggested to Taylan. Mylir answered for her. "No, we walk in silence, as quietly as we can. We're nearing the bridge, and that means plenty of crusaders will be in the area, heading for Ynys Morn. If they hear the local language being spoken, they'll come straight for us." Mark pulled a face, but he didn't protest. Taylan knew how he felt. Some stories would have alleviated some of the boredom of the long night's walk, but Mylir was right. The closer they got to Bryn Celli D, the more careful they would need to be. Chapter 24. Carla opened the door to Perrin's cabin. As she had expected, she found her son asleep. After stepping softly to his bed, she gently shook him by the shoulder. When his eyes opened, she held a finger to her lips. What's going on?" he asked sleepily. "We're going on a secret trip." His large dark eyes widened. "Where to? And why is it a secret?" "It's more fun this way," she replied. "We're going home. I want you to pack only your most essential things, then we'll go to the shuttle bay. Hurry up." She had already packed what she needed for the journey to Earth. She guessed Morgan wouldn't discover that she and Perrin had left the ship for several hours. She'd seen her take another member of the crew into her cabin only a few minutes ago, so now was her best chance for a long head start. As she waited for Perrin to gather the clothes and trinkets that were important to him, she wrinkled her nose at the memory of Morgan inviting the man in. How disgusting! There had been plenty of times she'd been tempted to do the same. Leading the crusade was a lonely occupation, but she had a position to uphold, standards to maintain. If she indulged herself, word would soon get out that Dwyr didn't view what happened at the ceremonies to be a sacred act, that she was as base and ordinary as the next person. A single instance of indiscretion could mean the loss of her demigod-like status forever. She had never explained Morgan's presence to her followers, but they had to perceive her as a close ally. As such, she should echo the Dwyr's behaviour. Morgan was jeopardising everything Kala had worked so hard for, just to satisfy her carnal needs. "I'm ready," said Perrin, carrying a bag as he walked toward her. "Good boy." "Are we going back to the last castle we were at?" "Yes, the one where you made a friend. You'll be able to see her again. If she isn't awake when we arrive, I'll have her woken up and brought out to play with you." Kala wasn't sure what time of day or night it would be when they reached West Bi. "Is Morgan coming too?" Perrin asked as they left his cabin. No. She's staying here. This trip's only for us." "So she doesn't know the secret?" "No, she doesn't." Perrin had been growing closer to Morgan over the weeks they'd spent aboard the Belladonna. Kala was certain their deepening relationship was entirely Morgan's doing. It was possible she only saw Perrin as a substitute for her own son, who Arthur had murdered, but Kala suspected the woman had a bigger ambition in mind. Her days as Dwyr were numbered if she didn't act. If she could just get to her books, she might learn how to defeat the interloper. Perrin looked troubled as they quickly walked the quiet passageways. "Don't worry," said Kala. "Morgan won't mind that we're leaving. When she finds out we're gone, she'll think it's so funny, she'll laugh and laugh." Perrin didn't seem convinced. "Will we see her again?" "Of course, darling. You don't need to worry about that." Kala imagined Morgan back in a cave, thousands of meters below ground, trapped forever. Unable to die, she would probably go mad eventually. The shuttle bay was open and empty. She'd only informed one of the pilots she wanted to return to Earth. She didn't know how far Morgan's tentacles extended through the crew. Recruiting people to spy on her and report her doings would be exactly the kind of thing the woman would do. She had to take a chance the pilot wasn't one of the spies. She told Perrin to climb the steps. Once they were both inside, her racing heart began to slow. The pilot only had to complete the pre-flight checks, then they would be on their way. Another big chance she was taking was that Morgan wouldn't arrive at the castle before her. It wouldn't take a genius to guess where she was going, and Morgan had the capability to travel through space without the need for a vessel to convey her. That had been one of the abilities Kala had thirsted deeply to learn, to know how to dissolve into a mist, to alter one's molecular structure while retaining the ability to move at will and to survive the rigours of space. That would be something worth knowing. She would have loved to see Talman's expression when she appeared at the Brez alone with no shuttle. It would have wiped that condescending, self-satisfied smirk off his face. But it was not to be. She sighed. "Ready to depart, ma'am?" came the pilot's voice over the intercom. "Yes," she called out. "I'm ready. Stop wasting time." Irritably, she fastened her seatbelt and told Perrin to do the same. The hatch closed, sealing them in. Just another few seconds and they would be underway. Kala waited impatiently for the engines to fire. Silence. What was the pilot doing? Didn't the man understand her haste? It was so hard to find reliable, intelligent staff. "Would you please hurry up?" she shouted. Nothing. No, not nothing. She could hear movement in the pilot's cabin. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged over the floor. Two figures appeared at the cabin door. The pilot, his head hanging at a crazy angle and his tongue protruding, and Morgan, her hand fastened around his neck. She had one arm outstretched, holding the man upright so his arms and legs hung loose, his knees bent as he was taller than her, had been taller than her. Kala couldn't move. She couldn't speak. Perrin calmly unfastened his seatbelt, got up and walked to Morgan's side. "I'm sorry, Mother, but I don't want to leave without Morgan. She's fun, more fun than my friend on Earth." "Thank you for telling me what your mother was doing," Morgan said to him. "You were right. It was a very silly joke. I don't think it's funny that you two would sneak away without me. In fact, I find it very rude." She addressed her final comment to Kala, her tone turning harsh. She turned to Perrin. "Do you think it was rude?" Perrin nodded gravely, holding eye contact with Kala. "What happens when people are rude?" Morgan asked. "They have to be punished." "That's what I was thinking. What a clever boy you are." Chapter 25. Crossing to Ynys Môn was going to be impossible without being seen. The tides in Afon Menai were strong and fast, and even if they could have swum across at night, the water would damage the equipment they were carrying. They would have to go over the bridge, but so many crusaders were arriving for the festival, there was never a time it was empty. Taylan and the brothers had watched the road for hours. Hordes of people were turning up. Meilir had originally estimated a few thousand would celebrate Midsummer at Bryn Celli D. They'd been forced to revise that figure to tens of thousands. The numbers increased their chances of being caught exponentially. On the other hand, if they were successful, the effects would be even more calamitous. They waited until dark. That way their clothes would not be easily seen. Though they resembled crusaders physically, the cult members dressed differently. The resistance fighters wore the industrially manufactured attire of the time before the invasion, while crusaders seemed to prefer homespun, hand-dyed textiles and handmade clothes. How they planned on keeping up that habit while also eating all the sheep, Taylan had never figured out. After debating whether to cross in a group or individually, they decided on the former. They were stronger as a unit, and it meant taking only one chance of being accosted. Mark was the best at faking a crusader accent, so he would be the one to answer if anyone spoke to them. When the road was fairly empty, they stepped out onto it from the hedgerow where they'd been hiding. Their packs would not look strange. Many crusaders had hiked here and were also carrying packs. Keeping tight with their heads down to discourage attention, they set off. The sky was clear and the moon was nearly full. Potholes dotted the road surface and weeds sprouted in the cracks. As they walked, cars occasionally drove up behind them and they had to move aside. The vehicles would continue, swerving to avoid the holes. A group arrived on horseback, steadily clip-clopping along. The resistance fighters moved out of the way and watched the animals and their riders pass by. They reached the bridge. It was only a couple of 100 meters long. They would soon be across it. Taylan walked between the four men. Meilir led the way. Medwyn and Madog walked on each side, and Mark brought up the rear. They couldn't risk her being recognised, even by the light of the moon. The bridge stretched out in front of them. 10 or so people were already on it. The horseback riders were leaving the farther end. From behind came the sound of more travellers, chattering and laughing excitedly. "Let's get this over with," murmured Meilir. To calm her nerves, Taylan focused on the crusaders ahead. They straggled out in couples and one larger bunch, but they seemed to be together. Some were children, walking more slowly than their parents. She guessed they had to be tired after their long day's trek. A sense of misgiving hit her. When they reached Bryn Celli D, they would plant incendiaries in the stands, displays and storage facilities for the festival. When the people gathered to witness the sunrise, they would detonate the devices. The result would be chaos, panic, and plenty of injuries and deaths as the masses fought to escape the fires. She knew how that felt. The scene of pandemonium as Arthur had harvested lives as he passed through the crowd at the launch ceremony was indelibly etched on her mind. She'd nearly been killed in the crush herself, bodies piling on top of her. It had only been through luck she'd survived. Her gaze was fixed on the Crusader kids walking ahead of her. They would be at the celebration too. Tired and not really understanding what was going on, probably not being able to see a thing, they would be there with their families when the fires broke out. They wouldn't stand a chance. Before she knew it, they were over the bridge. "Phew," came Mark's soft exclamation from behind her. Ditches edged the road on the Ynys Môn side, but at their farther banks were tall hedges. Meilir checked behind and in front of him several times before slipping into a ditch and then climbing behind the cover of a hedge. "We did it," said Mark, as they'd all followed him. "Not yet," said Madog. "We still have a long night ahead of us." "Let's rest a while and check everything over," said Meilir. As they sat down and began to pull the incendiaries out of their packs, Medwyn said, "We mustn't forget to steal some supplies for the return journey before we set these things off." "Good point," Madog agreed. "I don't fancy eating burnt biscuits all the way back." Taylan paused. "I'm having second thoughts. I'm not sure this is such a good idea." The men stopped what they were doing. "Well, in that case," said Medwyn, "let's pack up and go home. The great Taylan Ellis has spoken, fellas." "What's wrong?" Meilir asked. "Yeah, what's your problem?" Medwyn demanded. Meilir told him to shut up. "There are kids here," Taylan replied. "Crusader kids," said Medwyn. "What did you expect?" asked Madog. "It's a festival. People bring their children to festivals." Meilir was regarding her gravely. "I don't know," Taylan said. "I don't know what I expected. I suppose I didn't really think it through." Medwyn said, "That sounds like your "I said shut up," Meilir spat. "Taylan, do you think Dwyr Orr cared about what happened to our kids when she invaded? I'm surprised you, of all people, would balk at endangering Crusader children. For all you know, your own could be—" "Don't say it," Taylan interrupted. "I know what you mean. Maybe there's no point in me searching for them because they've gone somewhere they can never be found. But I think it's because of my children." "You're not the only parent here," said Madog. "I had 3 kids, a boy and 2 girls, all shot dead before my eyes." "God, I'm sorry. I didn't know." Madog thrust the incendiary he was holding into his pack before walking away into the field. Taylan silently cursed. Then a realization hit her. Was that why she hadn't been able to find her children? What if my kids were taken in by a crusader couple? What if they're hiding them from the Dwyr, and that's why she hasn't found them yet?
Then they wouldn't bring them here, would they? Said Medwyn, his jaw clenched.
I don't know. They're just kids. Who would take any notice of them? And they will have grown and changed since... Maybe it would look strange if the couple didn't attend the festival, so they took a chance and brought them along.
Now you're scraping the barrel, said Medwyn.
Throughout the discussion, Mark had remained silent with his head bowed. He looked up.
Taylan's right. We shouldn't hurt children. It's wrong. All for...
Medwyn turned to Meilir.
Don't tell me you're listening to this rubbish. We came here to do a job. Are we doing it or not?
Meilir didn't answer.
Forget I asked. I came here to do a job, and I'm doing it. And so's Madog. The rest of you can go to hell.
Chapter 26.
You told us it wouldn't be like this, Charles thundered. You told us they would listen.
Hans was resting his forehead on his palms. It was a disaster, but none of it was his fault. He'd done his best in the circumstances. What could he have done differently? He retraced each step since Maria had taken him to the cave in the mountains and the Jamaicans had locked him in a cage. Each choice he'd made had been either out of necessity or for the long-term good of everyone. No other option had been open to him except to remain with the resistance. He could never have survived alone. The EAC would have picked him up and tortured him in no time. He had been forced to pay lip service to the fighters' dreams of independence for Jamaica. They would never have accepted him otherwise. And if he'd crossed to the Alliance's side when they arrived, he would have been lynched. It was a mess.
Hans, said Devon gravely, what should we do? We can't go on much longer like this.
He looked out across the landscape to far-off Kingston as he considered his answer. Charles and Devon had come to speak to him at his villa. He'd returned there after the fighting had finished and made the place his home again. It had been entirely ransacked. All his luxurious furniture and fittings had been stolen or vandalised, the anger and resentment of Jamaica's underclass taken out on them with a vengeance. After burning the worst damaged items, he'd been left with some things to sit, sleep and eat on, and that was all he really needed. He'd looked forward to slowly refurbishing the house over time as the situation on the island improved. He'd even dreamed of spending evenings on the veranda, a gin and tonic in hand, gazing out on the country he'd helped to rebuild. It would have been a happy, prosperous nation, part of the great republic of the Britannic Alliance. He would have wished Maria was there with him to see it, and that would have been the only blemish on the perfect scene.
Hans, said Devon, I haven't decided yet. I need more time to think about it.
We don't have time, Charles insisted.
People are dying.
We need the Alliance's doctors and pharmaceuticals. 3/4 of the island still has no power. The farmers are too scared to go out in their fields until they're checked for ordnance. If they don't sow crops soon, in a few months we'll have a massive famine. We need clean water. We need help. Why won't the BA help us? Devon's jaw muscle worked as he sat next to Hans, cracking his knuckles.
We pushed too hard, he muttered. We said too much, too soon.
He was right. He'd hit the nail on the head. The Alliance's attitude towards its territories and protectorates was paternalistic. It would not stand for its dependents getting uppity, and its feelings would take a long time to change. Hans could have brought about that change over years, perhaps decades, but the opportunity had been denied him. If only the Royal Marines Major had delivered his message. The ministers and military chiefs would have known he was playing a game, stringing the Jamaicans along, that he was working to bring them into the fold. Those men and women of the BA government were used to subterfuge and artifice. They would have understood, nodded and smiled, knowing what it all meant. They would have agreed to support Jamaica. Everything had hung on that message.
"Barbados caved yesterday,"
Charles announced.
"They did?"
asked Devon.
"I didn't know." "Yes, they accepted the BA's terms. What choice did they have? They're worse off than we are."
"The Bahamas will be next," said Devon. Charles didn't reply, his features cloudy. Then he blurted, "We'll be last in line, begging for scraps, and it's down to him." He jabbed a finger at Hans. "Charles," Devon demurred. "Hans has always tried to help us."
"No, he hasn't. He's always tried to help himself. He was the one speaking out at the meeting. He was standing up for Jamaicans. Maria believed in him. Yes, and look where that got her. You can't blame him for her death. She was killed by a crusader, and the raid on the EAC headquarters wasn't even his idea." Hans was touched by Devon's loyalty, touched and ashamed. Though it was hard to admit to himself, he knew he didn't deserve it. He had always been self-serving, thinking only of himself and his grand plan for the Alliance, prepared to sacrifice everyone else to his schemes. Maria had known it. She had been smart. She'd seen through him. But she'd allowed him to pretend he was devoted to Jamaica because he could be useful. He put a hand on Devon's shoulder. "Thank you for sticking up for me. I appreciate it, my friend." Charles scowled. Hans rose to his feet. "I agree we're at somewhat of an impasse with the Alliance. Extricating ourselves without conceding too much will take some delicate negotiating, which requires careful planning. I don't want to be rude, but I need some time alone, time to gather my thoughts and figure out the best way to proceed." Said Charles. "His lordship is dismissing us. Let's go, Devon." As Devon drained his drink, Charles went on, "We'll be back in the morning to hear your ideas about what to do next. They'd better be good ones, and they'd better get us a fast solution to the crisis." Or what? Hans wondered. The two Jamaicans descended the wooden steps. "See you tomorrow, Hans," said Devon. "See you then, Devon. Charles." The latter didn't reply. A few moments later, Maria's car pulled out of the driveway onto the mountain road. Hans went inside the villa. Surveying the expansive space, now sparsely filled with the detritus of his former life as head of CIS, he took stock. His possessions had been whittled down to almost nothing. What would he need? He walked to his bedroom. At the bottom of one of the wardrobes was a large canvas bag. He took it out, opened it on his bed, and began to pack. When he'd filled the base with the few clothes he owned, he placed an interface on top of them. He went to the kitchen. There he gathered packets of dry food, snacks, candy bars, and 2 large plastic bottles of water. After a brief hesitation, he also picked up a knife. Returning to his bedroom, he put the knife and all the provisions in his bag. From his bathroom, he took a bag of toiletries and a comb. He returned to the veranda. His driveway remained empty.
No cars were passing on the road. The mountainside was quiet. No one was about. Going into the bathroom once more, he lowered the lid on the toilet and climbed onto it. He pushed up a ceiling tile and groped blindly in the space above. His fingers brushed cloth. Grasping it, he dragged a large pouch closer. It was heavy and resisted his pull. When it reached the hole, he lifted it down carefully. He sat on the toilet lid, loosening the pouch's strings, and examined its contents. Gold, platinum, and jewels glinted at him. It was a fortune, enough to buy several villas. Hans had never considered himself materialistic, but that didn't mean he hadn't learned from the experiences of his immigrant ancestors. The wisdom to always keep a portion of your wealth portable, in case of emergencies, had been passed down through the generations. His family had never belonged to the privileged elite. They had never enjoyed the sense of certainty about the future that came from being a member of the inner circle. But in this case, it had saved him. He tied the strings of the pouch and tucked it into a corner of his bag. What else? He only needed 3 more things. He crossed his bedroom to a set of drawers. From the top drawer he took a photograph, a silver necklace, and a small ceramic pot. "You're coming with me, my dear," he murmured. He was ready to leave. Chapter 27. Lorcan seethed as he sat in his shuttle, taking the long trip to Earth. Iolani had insisted on coming with him to the Camboto mine. She'd threatened to abandon the project, taking Camilla and Anders with her, and tell the media all about her kidnapping if he refused to allow her to come along. "You can hardly expect me to trust you after everything you've done," she had said. He would have to go to the mine and sort out the child labour problem with her in tow, scrutinising his every move. Worse, with her accompanying him, he couldn't in good conscience take any security or support people with him. The association with what he'd done to her would be too great. So it would be just the 2 of them. He rued the day he'd set foot inside her house in Suriname, eager to meet the great Iolani Hale. She and her damned dogs had become the bane of his existence. If only he could turn back time. Given the chance, he would choose to never go to see her, or at least leave her alone in her jungle hermitage. But then he might never have discovered the flaws in the project. He had to concede his experiences with Hale might have prevented a catastrophic disaster and tragedy. It was certainly better to be safe than sorry. And then there was Camilla Lebedev. Without Hale's interference, he would never have come to know her. The only positive side to making the journey to the surface with Hale was that Camilla had decided to accompany them. She would spend a few days visiting family and friends, and then she would return with them to the Brez when they'd finished their business at the mine. "I remember the last time I was aboard this shuttle," Hale remarked to her friend, seated next to her across the aisle from Lorcan. "I think it was this one, wasn't it?" she asked him. He gritted his teeth and didn't answer. "It was an uncomfortable ride," Hale remarked. "Was it?" asked Camilla. "These seats are pretty comfy. It certainly makes a nice change from flying economy. That's all funding institutions will ever pay for when I attend conferences. Cattle-class travel and budget hotels." "Oh, yeah," said Hale. "Last time I was here, I felt quite constricted." "I'd hate to subject you to another uncomfortable voyage," said Lorcan. "If you like, I can ask the pilot to take us back to the ship and you can disembark." "No, it's fine. I don't know why, but this time around I feel much more free." "Great," Lorcan said between his teeth.
Why not get up and walk around a bit? Right outside the airlock would be perfect."
Perhaps noticing his tenseness, Camilla said, "I'm sure you'll both sort out the mix-up at the mine quickly. It's probably just a misunderstanding."
"Huh," said Iolani, sounding utterly unconvinced. "I'm confident it's exactly that," Lorcan said. "The AP's hiring policies are very clear. I'm surprised they're using human labour at all. Technology exists that can perform almost all tasks that used to be undertaken by miners." "They're using children because it's cheaper," said Iolani, as if it were the most obvious explanation in the world. "Cheaper than machines?" asked Lorcan. "I don't think so." Hale rolled her eyes. "You don't have a clue, do you?" Camilla coughed. "I'll be glad to set foot on terra firma again." Lorcan pulled out earbuds from the receptacle in his armrest and pushed them into his ears. Usually, when he visited any of the many and various project subsidiary companies, he would inform the relevant manager of his plans. This wasn't out of consideration for the person, but simply because his time was precious. He didn't want to waste it waiting around for the relevant person to be called in to speak to him or to provide access to secure areas. He had inspectors to check everything was running smoothly and conforming to the locality's laws and regulations. This time he would give no notice. Regardless of what he discovered, he would fire the team responsible for inspecting the Camboto mine. There was no question about that. But he'd held off on making any staffing changes because he didn't want the manager to suspect something was up. He wanted to see the mine operating exactly as it did every day, when Ua Talman was not present to witness its transgressions. He'd hired a 4-wheel drive at the airport nearest the mine, a tiny place with a landing strip only long enough for light aircraft and no pad for a space shuttle. It was nevertheless more than 100 kilometres from their destination. With nothing more than small, poor villages en route, they would be forced to sleep in the car. The prospect did nothing to improve Lorcan's feelings about Hale's presence on the trip. She sat next to him in stoic silence as tens of kilometres of road passed beneath the car's wheels. At first he maintained the same attitude. He had no desire to even make small talk with her. He hated small talk at the best of times, let alone discuss anything important like her work on the Brez or, heaven forbid, the unpleasant interactions they'd had. But eventually he couldn't stand the monotony of nothing but the endless crunch of tyres on dirt road any longer. Also, there was something about simply sitting next to her, neither of them speaking, that drove a spike into his conscience. "Iolani, I know this will probably sound hollow, but I honestly had no idea that children were being employed at the Camboto mine. All the project subsidiaries have strict protocols to follow and standards to meet. If they fail in those regards, they are dropped. I don't know what went wrong at Camboto, but I hope to find out. As a minimum, the mine will cease operation from the time of our arrival and will not start up again until these problems are rectified." Some of the stiffness in her figure seemed to ease. She replied, "I appreciate it's difficult for you to admit failure, but it isn't me you should be telling all this to. It's those children and their families. No, it's important you hear it too. As to the people affected, in the case of any deaths or injuries, they will be fully compensated." She tutted and shook her head. "That's what it always comes down to with you, isn't it? Money. You think money will solve everything. It doesn't solve everything, but it goes a long way to helping. What would you have me do? I can't change what's happened." "You can change what will happen, though. Look around, Lorcan. This is a poor country, full of poor people, and a handful of very rich people who exploit everyone else. That's why you ended up employing children. Do you think their parents don't love them, and that's why they allowed them to go down into a pit? I'm not responsible for the decisions of their parents. I can say with absolute certainty I would never have allowed—" He choked as long-buried emotions rushed to the surface. Hale glanced at him. She waited as he got himself under control. "These problems are complicated," she conceded. "But unless people like you take them on, they'll never be solved. Ripping precious resources out of the earth and permanently removing them from the planet by using what amounts to slave labour isn't the answer." "That's quite a burden you'd like to place on my shoulders," said Lorcan. "The welfare of all humanity." "You're fond of saying the project is humanity's destiny. You're happy enough to be responsible for that. The well-being of others is a burden we should all shoulder, morally. If we aren't prepared to help our fellow human beings, what's the point? That's what we're about, isn't it? That's what civilization is. People helping each other. Civilization is about progress, improving the lot of your own people, your tribe, often to the detriment of others. That's the natural order of things in human behaviour. The project is the inevitable result of billions of years of evolution." Again she shook her head. "If you think that, you don't understand evolution. Human intelligence is not some pinnacle of achievement evolution trends toward. It's only a chance outcome of natural selection. The time humans have existed is a mere blip in the history of life on Earth. Other species have been, and continue to be, far more successful than us in evolutionary terms. The jury is still out on whether intelligence alone is a marker for survival over the long term. Several times in the last few thousand years, we've come close to throwing ourselves back into the Stone Ages. For instance, look at what you're doing." His hands tightened into fists. "Here we go again. As well as depleting the planet of finite resources, your project is destroying the environment wherever it operates. And for what? So you can build your ships, which, without intervention, would probably have become humankind's largest cemeteries. If you want to argue that human evolution is moving in a particular direction, all the signs indicate it's headed for self-annihilation, an evolutionary dead end." Silence fell again. Lorcan just didn't know what to say in reply. After a couple of minutes, Iolani added, "You're in a unique position. You're one of the very few people who can make a real difference. You have the power and authority to reverse the tide. Whether you decide to try, well, that's up to you." Chapter 28. With little hope of catching up to Taylan before she was on her way back to the Prizelli Hills, Wright had decided to try to meet her as she returned. It would have made more sense to wait at the Resistance hideout, as the chances of finding someone who was trying to keep out of sight in the wilderness were small. But Merlin was confident they could do it. The plan was, if she agreed to come with them to the Gallant and take part in the third attempt to assassinate the Dwyr, they would cut across country to the coast and then work their way down to the rendezvous point for their passage back to Ireland. If she agreed to come with them. Wright wasn't certain he wanted to try to persuade her. His sense of conviction about the mission was half-hearted at best. On their second day of travel, heading north across the rocky, rolling landscape, Arthur acted as he had when they'd drawn close to the Resistance hideout.
He halted, his broad back straightening and his eyes narrowing as he surveyed their surroundings. He spoke to Merlin using his first language. Wright hated it when they did that. He felt excluded, though he didn't think it was deliberate, only that Arthur was more comfortable using his mother tongue. After a few sentences back and forth, Arthur said to Wright, "I would like to make a small detour. I don't think it will take us much out of our way." "It may be beneficial in helping us find Taylan," said Merlin. "Arthur is better than I at reading the land." "Fine by me," Wright replied, feeling he was increasingly losing control of the situation. But he didn't know how to regain a hold on things. Arthur and Merlin were not Marines. They were like unstoppable forces, and he had no idea where they were leading him, the Alliance, or the planet. The detour was not as short as Arthur had predicted. They'd halted as the sun rose high, stayed hidden during most of the day, and travelled an hour into dusk before they found the place. The huge trees loomed dark in the fading light. They'd spotted them from higher ground a kilometre away. There were 10 or 12 standing in a circle. As they drew closer, their age became evident. The original trunks had died and hollowed, and side trunks had taken over the tree's growth. Could they really have existed during Arthur's time? Wright didn't know if trees could live so long, but he guessed they could, or perhaps new trees had grown or been planted in the same place. They stepped through a gap between the massive branches, thick with dark green needle-like leaves. In the centre was a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing stood stone ruins, no higher than Wright's waist. They reminded him of the little church in the Preseli Hills, where Merlin had retrieved Arthur's sword and armour from their hiding place. "Looks like this is it," he said. "What do we do now?" "I'd like to stay here tonight," said Arthur. "That's it?" Wright asked. He'd been expecting the king or Merlin to say there was something else to find that had been hidden for thousands of years. "That's all," said Arthur. "Just one night." He took some wire from his pack. He'd asked the resistance fighters for it, before disappearing for a while as Wright and Merlin set up camp under one of the trees. The ground was tinder dry, the branches and foliage so dense no rain ever penetrated. After they'd eaten, Arthur got up and walked away again, with no explanation of where he would be going or when he planned on coming back. The night was cloudy, and the area beyond their camp looked pitch black. It was impossible to see where Arthur had gone. "What's this about?" Wright asked Merlin quietly. "Why are we here?" "That's for Arthur to tell you, if he wishes." "So you know?" "He hasn't told me, but I can guess." Wright made a guess of his own. "Are those ruins we saw remains of a church?" "Yes, I believe so, though I don't recall ever coming here." "So he's praying again?" "Perhaps. I'm afraid I really don't know for sure, Major." The last time Arthur had prayed, he'd gone on to slaughter scores of people. That was what Taylan had said anyway. Maybe the king was anticipating they would encounter a lot of crusaders soon. Or maybe not. Merlin seemed to think it was something different this time. Wright had been thinking about what the alien had revealed to him a few days ago, about powers he represented that wanted the Alliance to succeed. He'd been reminded of something else that Taylan had told him. "You aren't the only extraterrestrial life form here on Earth, are you?" he asked Merlin. "Did I say I was?" The alien lay down on his side, propping himself up on one elbow. "Do humans really think you're alone in the galaxy?" Wright ignored his baiting. "At Dwyr Orr's invasion launch ceremony, Ellis said she saw a woman with the Dwyr who, when everything went to shit,
dissolved into a mist and floated away. That sounds like what you can do. Ellis said the EAC have an alien on their side too. Is that right? Ah, yes. Unfortunately, that is so. Surprised by the unusual candour, Wright pressed on. Does this being represent a power that opposes your own? Are the two of you in some kind of fight for control of Earth? That's a simplistic interpretation. I prefer to see the situation more philosophically. But your species grasps things better when they're stated in black and white terms, so let's allow that to stand. I'm no genius, but even I understand there are shades of grey in most things. I don't think we're as dumb as you seem to think we are. And yet here you are, murdering each other in cold blood every second of every day. Perhaps your appreciation of the level of humanity's development is, shall we say, more hopeful than realistic? Wright wanted nothing more than to wipe the smirk off Merlin's face, but he couldn't deny the truth of what he was saying. However, he wasn't about to allow the alien to get away with his insults scot-free. You don't seem to have much of a problem with helping Arthur to kill when it suits you. What is it you do to him that protects him from pulse fire? The alien turned onto his back. Impossible to explain. Sorry. Yet he didn't deny he was doing something. Merlin closed his eyes. He wasn't about to go to sleep. He didn't sleep. He didn't appear to have any need for it, and neither did he ever eat or drink anything that Wright saw. Guessing he wasn't about to get any more information from the creature, Wright got into his sleeping bag. As a mere human, he needed sleep. Something moving in the night woke him up. He opened his eyes and tried to figure out what it was. He could hear a soft rustling nearby, probably a fox searching for a snack. Peering into the darkness didn't reveal anything suspicious. He turned onto his side, preparing to get a few more hours of rest while Arthur did his thing, when, unprompted, Hans Jonter popped into his mind. The message! He'd forgotten to pass on Jonter's message to Colburn. Shit! After everything that had happened in Jamaica, he'd been in a bad state by the time he'd made it back to the Gallant. The message had entirely slipped his mind. Was it a bad screw-up? It was hard to tell. Jonter had made sure to remind him before he left the field hospital, so he guessed it was important to the ex-head of CIS that word got through to the Alliance he continued to work on their behalf. But surely the man had encountered other BA military personnel? He'd probably told them the same thing, and the message had been passed on. Whatever the gravity of the mistake, there was nothing Wright could do about it now. He couldn't risk comming Colburn from West BI. A single signal to the Gallant would be easy to identify and track for the origin location. He closed his eyes and tried to get more sleep. When he woke a few hours later, Merlin was gone, but Arthur had returned. Pre-dawn light filtered through the canopy. Arthur was awake, his hands behind his head, deep in thought. "Did you do what you came here to do?" Wright asked. "Yes, in a sense, though what I need to do cannot be done. Rather, what I did cannot be undone, but I feel better for coming here." At Wright's puzzled silence, he said, "I'm speaking in riddles, aren't I? I'm sorry, my friend. Have you ever done anything you deeply regretted?" Wright thought of the campaign to retake Jamaica. He thought of Patel falling backward into his arms, her face gone. He thought of his last sight of Elphick, climbing down through the open manhole. At one point, he would have been able to justify to himself what he'd done. Now he was finding it hard. He replied, Too many things. It's part of being human, said Arthur. That's what Merlin would say. It's part of trying to do right. But what I did here was not because I wanted to do right. I committed a great sin. My unnatural son was born, and the result was the loss of everything I had worked for. My kingdom fell. Wright could take a stab at what the sin was, but he didn't understand what the rest of it meant. He guessed Taylan probably knew. If they ever found her, he might ask her, but he didn't want to probe too deeply into what seemed to be a sensitive subject. If you're ready to move on, he said, we should do that. We can get 2 or 3 hours of walking in before broad daylight. I wonder where Merlin's got to. I'll look for him, said Arthur. While he was gone, Wright broke camp. He had been waiting for his companions to return for a while when Arthur came back alone, or not entirely alone. He was carrying 3 dead rabbits. He smiled with boyish glee. The wire you have these days works better than the twine we used to use in my time. He removed the wire from the animals' necks and gutted them before tying them by their back feet to his belt. We can eat them later. No sign of Merlin? No, I couldn't. The alien poked his head under an overhanging branch. All ready? Chapter 29. I told you once, I am mistress here, said Morgan softly. I hope from now on you will remember that. Kala glared at her, but she swallowed the response that came naturally to her lips, instead forcing out, I will remember. Her time in the Belladonna's brig had taught her a lot. It had taught her that what she had feared the most, that Morgan would get Perrin under her control, had already happened. At some time in their weeks aboard the ship, in the course of teaching her son telepathy, his affection had transferred to her usurper. She had also learned that Morgan found it easy to make those around her to do her bidding. Kala's crew had carried her, fighting and struggling, to a cell and locked her away. The people she'd thought slavishly adored her had been turned against her in an instant. The final thing she'd come to understand during her time of incarceration was that she was nowhere near ready to give up. She would rather die than allow Morgan to steal her child and her domain from her. Do you agree to never attempt to leave this ship without my permission? Asked Morgan. I do. That you will never spend time with your son unless I am present? Kala's chest constricted. I agree. That you will do exactly as I say regarding the running of the crusade? I will. Then you may be released, said Morgan. The guard unlocked the door. For a week, Kala had sat behind the transparent wall, on view to all who passed by, humiliated as a display to men and women who had once worshipped her. She stepped through the gap. What's that on your arms? Morgan asked. Kala pulled her sleeves down, but Morgan pushed her right sleeve up again. Off and on, for days, Kala had scratched her arms and legs, taking out her anger and frustration on her body. She had dug her fingernails into her skin, clawing at her flesh, only achieving satisfaction when her blood ran freely. Why have you done this? Asked Morgan, pushing up Kala's left sleeve. She held Kala's gaze questioningly. Weren't you the one who said the crusade needed a blood sacrifice? This is not sacrifice. This is something else. Morgan passed a hand over the damaged skin. Kala felt a tingling sensation as it healed and became whole again. She was angry. The wounds meant something to her.
something she couldn't put into words. She didn't want Morgan to control her body as well as her behaviour. She didn't tell her she'd also hurt her legs. "Do not do that again," said Morgan. "Where's Perrin?" "He's in my cabin, practising something I taught him earlier today." Kala stiffened. "You may return to your suite," Morgan said as they left the brig. "I want you to take the rest of the day to reflect on what's happened. It's a shame things had to come to this. I thought I'd made it clear when you released me how things were going to be, but obviously I didn't make it clear enough. We can get along, providing you adopt the right attitude. I'm not interested in leading the crusade. I have no desire to be worshipped. Your people's love means nothing to me, and your ceremonies are boring. But I will not be deceived, and I will not be pushed aside. In truth, your behaviour saddens me. You are my kin, though far distant. We should be allies, not enemies." I would like to be your ally," Kala said. Morgan gave her a look that implied she didn't quite believe her. Could Morgan read her mind? Kala hoped not. She had the impression from her sessions on telepathy that it couldn't happen without both subjects being willing. "It would definitely be preferable if we could get along," Morgan said. "We have much work to do if the crusade is to achieve its goals." Kala was hanging to a shred of hope. She judged that Morgan considered Perrin too young to assume the role she had in mind for him, that she still needed Kala for the time being. When her usefulness ran out, that would be the end of her. She had until then to get rid of Morgan, but from now on she would have to tread exceptionally carefully. They'd reached her suite. "Relax," Morgan said. "Think. I know you'll see the wisdom of our new way forward." As soon as she'd gone, Kala sat on the edge of her bed, gripping the silken coverlet tightly. She waited several minutes, thinking things over. When she thought Morgan had to be out of hearing distance, she requested refreshments. The man who brought them to her looked a little familiar, but she hadn't paid much attention to the lower ranks aboard her flagship. They had been of no importance to her until now. "What's your name?" she asked, as the man put down the tray on her bedside table. Without meeting her gaze, he replied, "Cookson, ma'am." "Cookson. Do you know where I've been for the past week?" "I do, ma'am." "And what do you think about that?" "I think it's a terrible shame. We all do. But no one was able to stop it." "No one was able to stop it? Explain." "We can't seem to do what we want to do whenever that woman, Morgan, has anything to do with it." "I see. So you wanted to release me from the brig, but you found you couldn't." "Something like that. It was more like we would go there, and then we would forget why we were there until we left again. Then we would remember and return, only for the same thing to happen. It's strange." The man's words brought her joy. So Morgan hadn't managed to turn her followers against her. She was only exerting some sort of mind control over them. If that was the case, there had to be a limit to what she could do, either by distance or by number of people she could influence, or to what extent. At some point they would return to Earth, and then, possibly, Kala could harness the support of the Crusaders against her latest enemy. And if she could find out who had imprisoned Morgan all those years ago, all the better. There was hope yet. "Thank you, you're dismissed," she told Cookson. The biggest problem was Perrin. Kala doubted Morgan was controlling her son's mind. The bond she'd created with him meant she didn't need to. The boy was young and easily impressed. He thirsted for the knowledge Morgan could teach, in the same way she had herself. The enticement held great sway over him, and Morgan had been quick to exploit it. Kala could destroy Morgan and regain control of her life, but it would mean nothing if she lost Perrin. Chapter 30. Bryn Celli D didn't look like much, in Taylan's opinion. From the outside it was just a long grassy mound. She guessed the inside had to be more impressive. She'd heard the standing stone the sun would light up when it rose tomorrow was carved in incredibly ancient symbols, predating even Arthur's time. But her chances of getting a look at it was zero. Thousands of crusaders thronged the site, barely held back by the ropes and guards that ringed the mound. Brightly coloured pavilions dotted the fields all around, housing stalls selling food, drink, trinkets, souvenirs, textiles and camping supplies. Some of the pavilions were for entertainment purposes. Strains of music and laughter of audience watching performances could be heard coming from them. Others seemed to have nefarious purposes, judging from the closed entrances, the hawkers standing outside, and the glances to the left and right of any customers who ventured in. The low rise Taylan was standing on was around 1/2 kilometre from the festival site, but scents from it still reached her, barbecuing meat, wood smoke, incense. What struck her most forcibly was how old it all looked. There was very little technology on show, perhaps only the security guards' pulse rifles. No screens or hollows, no electronic toys for the kids, nothing that required electricity to run. The cars some of the attendees had arrived in had been parked far away, out of sight. It was like watching a history docuvid based on pre-industrial times. Beyond the pavilions, a sea of tents stretched to the horizon, with figures moving between them. She had a brief vision of flames leaping from tent to tent, and people running, screaming, on fire. "I'm sorry. I just can't do it." Meilir stood next to her. "I understand." He'd asked her to think over her decision, and, out of respect for him, she had. She felt churlish. She had asked to come along and take part in this attack on the Crusaders. Her inclusion could have placed an additional burden on the brothers, though, as it turned out, she didn't think that had been the case in the end. "I'll help steal supplies for the trek back to the hideout," she said. "You don't have a problem with that too?" asked Meilir, seeming to want to make light of the situation. "I don't have a problem with stealing, and I don't have a problem with attacking the other side's military. But this? Look. There are little kids here, babies, and these people, most of them have probably never held a weapon. They've moved in from Europe after the invasion. I don't know why they follow the Dwyr. They're probably just deluded. People can be incredibly dumb, but that doesn't mean they deserve to die." "Let me ask you something," said Meilir. "If you or I were to walk among those crusaders now and tell them who we are, what do you think they would do?" Taylan swallowed. He had a point. She recalled standing on the quayside at Dwyr Orr's invasion launch, waiting for the right moment to shoot the woman, knowing the crowd would rip her limb from limb if they knew her intention. "What would they do, Taylan?" he pressed. "They would kill us. I can't deny it. But that's because..." "Because they're deluded? Or because, deep down, they're depraved and vicious?" "Maybe their beliefs have made them like that. But people can change.
If they could be taught a different understanding of the world, they would change." "I think you give them too much credit," said Meilir. "The older ones didn't grow up like that. They saw and heard what Dwyr Orr's way had to offer, and they chose it of their own free will. They weren't indoctrinated. Her methods appealed to them. All the invasions, murdering and enslaving the local populaces, turning back the wheel of progress, they want all that. And you know that if our positions were reversed and crusaders were standing here watching a crowd of our people preparing for a celebration, they would not be having this discussion. They would not hesitate to hurt us." The memory of the search patrol who had hunted her down flashed into her mind, their joy at wounding her and cold debate over whether to kill her. They'd seen her as less than human, an other. "I know," she conceded. "I know you're right. But that doesn't mean we have to be the same as them. We can be better. If we stoop to their level, we've become like them. Then they've won, haven't they? As I see it, if we don't stoop to their level, they will win." "You sound like Medwyn," she said bitterly. She'd thought Meilir was better than this. "I see his point of view, but I don't believe we're the same. Medwyn won't feel a thing for any crusaders who die tomorrow, but I will feel sad for the innocent lives lost. I'm not completely callous. However, death is inevitable in war, and we didn't start this war, though I hope we'll finish it." He stepped down from the rise and left. Taylan's heart sank. She hated going against the brothers. Most of them had been nothing but kind to her. If it hadn't been for Mark finding her after she'd been shot and Meilir nursing her back to health, she'd be dead. She'd been hoping Meilir might change his mind when he heard her thoughts, but he'd come down on Medwyn's side. Madog couldn't be blamed for feeling the same. The sun disappeared behind a cloud and a chill wind started up. Thoughts of the people who would die in the morning already grieved her, and she hadn't forgotten her earlier fear that, by some remote chance, her own children might be among the throng. It wasn't only a matter of refusing to take part in the scheme. She couldn't allow it to happen. She had to stop Meilir and the others from planting the devices tonight. But how could she do that? She'd tried reasoning with them, and it hadn't worked, except perhaps for Mark. He seemed to agree with her. She couldn't physically stop the men. It would be 3 against 1. Could she hide or destroy the devices? It was unlikely. Medwyn would keep a close eye on them now he knew her feelings. She traced Meilir's steps, leaving the high ground. In a few hours most of the crusaders would be sleeping. They would go to bed early in readiness for the midsummer sunrise. The brothers would sneak into the areas closest to the mound and hide the incendiaries. When the celebration was at its height, they would set them off by remote control, and terror and bedlam would ensue. She couldn't allow it to happen. Returning to the hidden place near the hedgerow where the brothers were waiting for the right time to make their move, Taylan's stomach churned with discomfort. What the hell was she doing? She was trying to figure out a way to protect crusaders, the very people who had killed her friends and neighbours and separated her from her children. They supported Dwyr Orr, who had tortured Wilson horribly and committed who knew how many more atrocities. Her feelings were all screwed up. She wished she could talk to Abacha, but he was far away aboard the Valiant while the ship underwent repairs. Even to cuddle Boots might help,
but she didn't know where the cat was anymore. She was alone, and she had to decide the right thing to do, and then how to do it. Chapter 31.
"What I don't understand is," said Wright, "why we're trying to kill the Dwyr but not this other alien who's with her."
Merlin and Arthur were walking ahead of him along a trail between two high hills. Arthur's long stride and Merlin's apparently inexhaustible stamina meant he was often lagging behind them. It was hard to keep in top shape when you spent most of your time living on a starship, and they'd already walked over 100 kilometres. Still, tomorrow was Midsummer's Day, and Taylan would begin her return journey soon. They probably only had another few days' walk ahead of them until their paths crossed hers, somehow.
"I said," Wright remarked, preparing to repeat himself. "I heard you," Merlin replied, without looking back. "But I don't quite understand. Why would we try to kill the Dwyr's companion?" "Because she has to be mixed up in all this too. She was at the launch ceremony, Ellis said, right beside the Dwyr. Who knows? She might even be responsible for the Dwyr's messed up thinking."
"In my experience, humans are quite capable of messed up thinking all by themselves." Choosing to ignore the insult, Wright went on,
"How do we know this alien isn't the power behind the throne, so to speak?"
That certainly seemed to be how things were with Merlin and Arthur. It was their relationship that had prompted his line of thought. Arthur did whatever Merlin told him to do, basically.
"Maybe we've been targeting the wrong person all along," he said.
He hadn't forgotten Merlin's refusal to enter the Dwyr's castle grounds, saying there was a barrier he couldn't cross. What had that been about? Had it been something to do with the alien on the enemy's side? Merlin slowed his pace a little so that Wright caught up to him and Arthur walked ahead of them both.
"I have to say, this time we've spent together has been somewhat eye-opening for me. Every so often you say something impressively insightful." "Well, thanks, but I'm not interested in impressing you. A simple answer to a straight question would be nice, though."
Merlin didn't seem insulted. He studied the thin line of bare dirt they were following for a moment, then stooped and picked up a rock about the size of his fist. He held it up for Wright's perusal. "Tell me, Major, if you were to try to kill this stone, how would you go about it?" "Kill the stone? What do you mean?"
"I mean, would you strangle it, shoot it, or blow it up? I suppose blowing it to pieces would destroy it."
"And would it be dead then?"
"No, it would be separated into smaller fragments. You can't kill something that was never alive."
"This stone was never alive? Are you sure about that? Do you know what it's made from? What if it's limestone, formed originally from sea creatures?"
"From the non-living shells of sea creatures," Wright corrected. "And even if it was alive once, it isn't any longer."
"How do you know?"
"Because it doesn't move, reproduce, respirate."
He trailed off, trying to remember his biology lessons from when he was a kid. "It doesn't meet the definition of a living organism, according to the criteria humans have decided."
"Yes."
"Also, it's clearly not bloody alive." "Are you confident those criteria are correct?" the alien asked. Wright sighed, wishing he'd never begun the discussion. Maybe that was Merlin's intention, to confuse him and tie him up with semantics, distracting him from something important.
"You're saying we've got our definition of life wrong?" he replied. "Get to the point. Are you trying to tell me the rock's alive, but I, as a poor dumb human, can't tell?"
"No." Merlin tossed the rock to the side of the trail. "What I'm trying to tell you is that you might as well try to kill that piece of mineral as kill Dwyr Orr's companion." He strode faster, rejoining Arthur's side. Wright had a brief vision of grabbing the rock, leaping on the alien's back and smashing his head in with it. He put the vision to one side. Chapter 32. Taylan opened her eyes. A little farther along the hedge, barely visible in the gap beneath it, Angharad's sons lay sleeping. At least she hoped they were asleep. The men had come back from planting the incendiaries more than an hour ago, and now they were supposed to be taking a short rest until just before dawn. Then they would wake, slip closer to Bryn Celli D and set off the devices. She had deliberately chosen to sleep at a distance away from the men. Outwardly, she'd given the appearance of being sickened and saddened by what they were doing. That hadn't been hard to fake, but it had only been a ruse to explain her decision to physically separate from them. In fact, she wanted to be able to leave without notice when the time was right. She wasn't only saddened because of what the brothers were doing. Her heart felt heavy at the knowledge that this was where she would part ways with them. After what she was about to do, they would never accept her into their company again. If they saw her, they might even try to hurt her. She couldn't return to the hideout in the Prezelli Hills. Her time in the West BI Resistance was over. She climbed slowly to her feet, trying to avoid making too much noise. The wind was strong, and the creaking and rustling of the hedge should cover the quiet sounds she was forced to make. She grabbed her nearly empty pack. Keeping to the vegetation, she walked away from the sleeping men, planning on cutting over the fields when she couldn't be easily observed. Footsteps sounded behind her. She swung around. A figure loomed. As her hand flew to her knife, the man said, "Taylan, it's only me." "Mark." She relaxed. "I didn't recognize you. It's too dark. What are you doing?" "I'm coming with you." "No, you can't." "Why?" "You're going to remove the incendiaries, aren't you?" Despite agreeing with her when she'd first mentioned her reservations about sabotaging the Midsummer Festival, Mark had gone with his brothers to plant the devices. She guessed that, when it came down to it, he hadn't wanted to stand up to the others. She hadn't blamed him. He was only young, about 17 or 18. "What I'm doing is none of your business," she retorted. "Go back and leave me alone." Speaking harshly to someone she liked so much was painful, but necessary. She didn't want to be responsible for Mark provoking his brothers to hate him. "I want to come with you. I don't agree with what they're doing. It's like you said, it would be wrong to hurt the children and babies. They haven't done anyone any harm." "Go back, Mark!" She strode away from him, worried that one of his siblings would wake up and see them. He followed her, trotting at her side. "You don't know where they planted them. I do. I can take you to them, and we can remove them together." It was true. She didn't know exactly where all the incendiaries were. She'd hoped to find them by guessing where she would have put them. "And then what?" she asked. "What will you do then?" "I'll sneak back. There isn't enough time. One of them is bound to wake up and notice you're gone. Then they'll see I've left too, and they'll put two and two together. Your brothers love you, but they'll never forgive you for this. I can manage by myself. I don't need you." "You do. I'm telling you, you do. You'll never find them all, and I don't care if they find out I helped you. You should care. They are the only family you have left.
Believe me, you need to stick with your family, now more than ever. Don't make my mistake."
They'd walked a fair distance while they had their hurried conversation. Taylan estimated it was safe now to turn and head for the ancient mound. She had to get there soon. The Crusaders' camp was already stirring, and a few people were wandering between the pavilions, even though none had opened yet. She was taking a risk of being challenged as it was.
"Mark, please, you're making this harder for me." "Then stop arguing. I'm coming too, whether you like it or not."
She relented. What else could she do? He might be young, but he was tall and strong, taller and stronger than two of his brothers. She couldn't stop him from accompanying her if he insisted on it, and he was old enough to make his own decisions. Without answering him, she turned and began to jog across the rough grass. His boots thudded along with hers on the soft, damp ground. The outlying pavilions drew closer.
"The nearest one is over there," said Mark, pointing at a candy-striped canopy. "Medwin took care of that one. I'm not sure exactly where he put it."
There were probably quite a few places in the pavilions to hide a device. They were little bigger than Taylan's palm, flat and round and magnetised on one side. The enormity of what she was trying to do began to hit her. They'd bought 30 of them, and she only had a short time to find them all.
"Did you plant some on your own?" she asked. "Yeah, I'll collect them first, then we can find the others."
"We should stop running," said Taylan. "It'll look suspicious." They slowed to a walk. Trying her best to look like a freshly woken crusader stretching her legs in an early morning stroll, she approached the outer edge of the pavilions with Mark.
"You're sure there's one in there?" she asked, nodding at the brightly coloured canvas. "Positive." "OK, I'll go and take a look. I suppose you should find the devices you hid," she added reluctantly. "But for God's sake, be careful. I'll meet you south of the mound." Mark loped away. Taylan angled the direction of her walk to bring her close to her target. Its vivid hues were pale and greyish in the early morning light. Sounds of the awakening camp came to her on the breeze, babies crying to be fed, parents scolding children, someone chopping wood. When she was within 2 meters of the pavilion, she took a quick look around to make sure she was unobserved and then veered sharply left. Another quick survey, and she stepped between 2 overlapping edges of canvas. In the dim interior, it was hard to figure out what was what. As her eyes adjusted and her nose caught a familiar scent, she realized she was in a beer tent. Kegs were stacked behind a chest-high bar. Tall stools stood silently around similarly tall bar tables. The grass had been trampled flat and turned to sticky mud. Where would Medwin have hidden the incendiary? It had to be somewhere the servers and customers wouldn't usually have cause to look at. She quickly inspected the undersides of tables and stools. They were all bare. There was no point in searching among the kegs or glasses, she reasoned. When the workers arrived to set up, they would be the first places they would go. She checked behind the bar, running a hand on the lower surface and peering into all the nooks and crannies. Nothing. She straightened up and turned a circle. Where could it be? Had Mark been wrong about Medwin hiding a device in here? Or had Mark been lying? She halted. Had the brothers anticipated her plan and persuaded him to trick her, to send her on a wild goose chase, wasting her time until they finally triggered the incendiaries? It was possible, but she didn't believe it. Mark was too honest and decent.
Regardless, she had no choice except to carry on looking. Medwin hadn't felt any scruples about endangering the lives of the Crusaders. He would have put his device where it would be the most dangerous, where the fire would catch and spread quickly. Her gaze rose. The canvas! After several days in the sun, the cloth was stiff and dry, and she doubted the EAC encouraged its people to use anything so technologically advanced as fire-retardant chemicals. There it was! At the junction between an upright strut and a roof support, a black curved edge poked out. If she hadn't looked directly at it, she would never have noticed it. Grabbing a stool, she ran to the base of the strut. In another second, she'd climbed up and lifted out the device. 1 down. 29 to go. Chapter 33. Since the BA's global presence had dwindled, Lorcan had scaled down the armed personnel at the Camboto mine, as he had at many of his semi-legal and illegal operations around the world as a cost-saving measure. Consequently, when no guards had challenged him as he approached the mine in the rented car with Hale, he hadn't been too concerned. But when they got closer up to the fence around the site, and there was no sign of even a security team, his anger had begun to boil. Travelling with Hale and hearing her constant criticism was bad enough, but his experience at Camboto had topped even that. He was relieved to be finally on his way back to the Brez, though he had plenty of work to do. The cobalt mine had been an example of what happened when he took his eye off the ball for too long. He'd been distracted by Hale's interference in the project. That was his biggest problem, but he couldn't do anything about it. He recalled the mine manager's widening eyes and gaping mouth as he appeared in her dirty little office, Hale trailing him. What an annoying, obsequious woman she'd been. But no amount of creeping and obfuscating could hide the facts. Mining had been Lorcan's business from the early days. It was what he'd built his empire on, and he was not so out of touch that he couldn't tell at a glance what should be happening, where, how, and using what equipment. After a lot of feet-dragging and excuses, the manager had finally agreed to a snap inspection. With a surly look and her shoulders hunched, she'd escorted them to the elevator shaft and taken them down below ground. Lorcan had insisted on seeing everything. The woman had been cutting corners and bending rules with an arrogant flagrancy that shocked him, seasoned though he was in his experience of the business. He'd seen a boy of perhaps 12 or 13 standing at a ventilation shaft operating a fan. Processes that should have been automated were being carried out by children. "A temporary measure until I can get it fixed," the manager had spluttered. "The younger the labourers, the cheaper they are. I barely have to pay them anything at all." Lorcan couldn't remember what he'd said. A red rage had descended on him. He might have struck the woman. He simply couldn't recall his actions. What he did remember was Hale screaming at him to calm down. Temporary measure? It had been a blatant lie. Why pay a qualified engineer for a repair or invest in new machinery when you could pay a kid a pittance? Yet, reflecting on the incident as the shuttle flew to the Brez, he understood what had affected him most hadn't been the barefaced lying of the manager, or her pathetic cost-cutting excuses, or even the danger created by her stupidity and neglect. It had been how the boy reminded him of his own. His lips thinned to a line, and he looked out the window, not seeing anything of the starscape or the distant corkscrew of the Brez. The old wound never seemed to heal, no matter how many years passed or how much he thought or didn't think about what had happened and the family he'd lost. Hale and Camilla were talking, and gradually their conversation infiltrated his thoughts. Camilla was relating a story about a cousin who had become a net celebrity by promoting healing with coloured water. He dyes the water different hues depending on the ailment, saying the colours give off vibrations, and he has to achieve exactly the right set of vibrations for the treatment to work. The patients are supposed to immerse themselves naked for hours at a time. Of course, if it doesn't work, it's because the patient lacks faith in the process and their negative vibrations are affecting it. Of course, said Hale. Do you know how much money he's making? No, but it's a lot. Looks like we have another Dwyr Orr on our hands. I certainly hope not. Camilla turned to Lorcan. You might receive an application from him any day now. He's got the creds for a ticket to a new world, I'm sure of it. He'll need it to get away from all his disappointed clients, Hale said, when they finally come after him. Oh, I'm sure they won't, Camilla replied. You know what people are like. They'll just keep sending him money, hoping it'll work one day, or they'll find another quack to follow. Did you say anything to him? Asked Hale. No. What's the point? He seems to believe in it himself. Either that or he's a good faker. Thanks for the heads up, said Lorcan. Let me know his name and I'll be sure to screen him out. The last thing we need in the colony is a snake oil salesman. If you think you'll be able to screen them all out, Hale said, you're going to be disappointed. Believing in nonsense is part of human nature. I suppose you're right, he replied. She seemed to have softened toward him a little bit since their time at the mine. Maybe she'd come to accept he wasn't quite the monster she'd thought. I only wish you would agree to come along, he told her. They'd been through a lot, and some days he couldn't bear the sight of her, but that hadn't dulled his perception that she would be a huge asset on a new world. The offer remains open, you know. You never give up, do you? You can't blame me for trying. He gave her a half smile. How do you feel about your other scientists, Lorcan? Asked Camilla. Are we welcome to accompany you on the project too? Camilla had a cheeky look in her eye. He couldn't tell if she was joking. After Hale's blank refusal, it hadn't occurred to him to propose that Camilla and Anders joined the colony expedition. Naturally, he replied. You would be very welcome, free of charge. Now there's an offer I might find hard to refuse. Landing in 5 minutes, said the pilot over the comm. A tiny spark of warm hope flared in Lorcan's heart. Camilla Lebedev aboard the Brez as she set out on her great voyage. It would be a pleasure he hadn't anticipated. He enjoyed her company immensely. She was extremely intelligent, witty, cultured and affable. She had none of Hale's sharp corners and, like Hale, her input would be invaluable. He'd found the visit to the Camboto mine deeply distressing and unsettling, but things were looking up. The project was back on track and more poised for success than ever now that top scientists were ironing out some of the wrinkles. Lorcan straightened up and fastened his seatbelt. The first thing he saw as he disembarked in the Brez's Bay was Anders waiting at the entrance. He'd remained behind, continuing to work while the others had their excursion on the surface. Lorcan was mildly alarmed when he saw him. Had something gone wrong? Had the man discovered a fatal flaw in the project? But then he noticed that Anders wasn't looking at him. He was peering at a spot behind him, the shuttle hatch. When Camilla and Hale stepped out, his expression brightened and he began to walk toward them. Good trip? He asked Lorcan. Before he could reply, Anders raised his arms and stepped past him. "Darling," he said, "I missed you." He was embracing Camilla. Lorcan felt his mouth drop open. Noticing his surprise, Iolani took his arm and led him away. "They're married," she said softly. "Didn't you know?" "No." He had the uncomfortable sensation of something slipping away from him. He frowned. "But they have separate cabins." "Yes. Anders snores like a walrus in heat, and they have completely different working habits. Back on Earth, they live next door to each other." She gave him a sympathetic look. "Sorry if that was a shock." No, he said, struggling to regain his composure. "Their private lives are their own business. I'm just a bit surprised, that's all. It doesn't change anything." "Good, because I need to talk to you about something else. I could tell the visit to the Camboto mine disturbed you, and we couldn't talk on the shuttle with Camilla around." He suppressed a groan. What was Hale going to harp on about now? He'd fixed the problem at the mine. If this was more rubbish about asteroid mining... "You really need to help the Britannic Alliance." "What? Why on Earth or in space would I help them?" For most of the duration of the project, the Alliance had been hampering his efforts, and the one time he'd helped them out of a dire situation, he hadn't received any recompense or gratitude. "If you do manage to leave the solar system in the next few years," said Hale, "imagine what you'll be leaving behind. If the EAC get control, it'll throw the whole place back into the Dark Ages. 1. What makes you so sure the BA needs my help? The latest on the vid news is they've taken back the Caribbean. And 2. Why should I care about the state of the world I'm leaving behind? People are free to choose to follow a cult, and they're free to live with the consequences of their decisions. Lorcan, you know as well as I do the Alliance is spread too thin. Other powers are either too weak, too mired in petty wars, or too apathetic to mount an adequate defence to the Dwyr if she gets her act together. I admit she does seem distracted lately, but that could change any time. As to your second point, do you really want to see our home planet reduced to a pre-Enlightenment, anti-intellectual wasteland? And if that doesn't sway you, think of this. What if the project fails? What if the ship's engines don't work as well as you expect? Or humans can't survive cryosuspension? Or you can't find anywhere suitable for colonization? And you have to come home. With Dwyr Orr running everything, think about what kind of Earth you'll find on your return. Chapter 34. Taylan only waited a short while for Mark to meet her south of Bryn Celli D. He was grinning as he trotted toward her, his pockets bulging with incendiary devices. She remained conflicted about involving him in her scheme to prevent his brothers from sabotaging the ceremony, but she didn't feel she had a lot of choice about it. "That was quick," she said. "It's easy to be fast when you know exactly where they are." He gave her the devices he'd collected, and she put them in her pack, deactivating each one as she did so. "Let's find the others," she said. "We don't have much time." The sky had brightened even as she'd waited for him, and the number of early arrivals was increasing. The people running the refreshment and entertainment areas would be among them, as they would be setting up for the long day ahead. "Mylir planted one over there," said Mark, "in the admissions tent." A small booth stood next to a gap in the rope barrier surrounding the ancient mound. It seemed that a select few crusaders would be allowed inside the mound itself to witness the sun's beams striking the inner stone. They would probably show something to an attendant in the booth before passing inside. Mylir's choice would create a devastating effect if the device went off and would probably kill whoever stood inside the small tent at the time. The incendiaries spat a highly flammable, clinging oil when they were triggered. Someone was approaching the tent. "You grab it," said Mark. "I'll distract them." "No, it's too dangerous," Taylan protested. But he was already on his way, adopting a trajectory that would cross the Crusaders' path. She fast walked to the small booth, her head down, trying not to look conspicuous. As she reached it, from the corners of her eyes, she saw Mark accidentally collide with the man. She slipped in the back of the booth. Her gaze quickly roved every surface. The place was almost bare. Just a table, a couple of chairs, some open-topped empty boxes. She scanned the ceiling in case Mylir had taken a leaf from Medwyn's book, but the frame was empty. From outside came the strains of a conversation. Mark talking to the Crusader. Her stomach twisted into knots. He was taking a huge risk. If his fake accent slipped, the man would realise he wasn't one of them. Mark had always been cocky about his ability to mimic Crusader talk, making fun of them to entertain the resistance fighters. Too cocky. She turned, about to step outside and attract his attention, to extract him from the dangerous conversation, when her boot hit something solid. Beneath one of the chairs was a metal cylindrical container, maybe somewhere to put trash. She opened the lid, but it was empty. She lifted it and tipped it upside down. The black incendiary clung to the underside. She tore it off, threw down the container and darted out. Mark and the Crusader were still talking. Jumping up, she waved her arms. Mark saw her and ended his conversation with a nod and a smile. "What on earth are you doing?" Taylan hissed when he reached her. "It's fine. He didn't suspect a thing, and if I hadn't delayed him, he would have discovered you searching the tent for sure. Did you find it?" "Yes, I did. But don't do that again, okay? I might want to prevent people here from being hurt, but you mean more to me than them. If you find you have to take that level of risk again, I want you to bail. I can look after myself." "Mylir put another in that guard's hut," he said. Gritting her teeth at his failure to acknowledge what she'd said, she replied, "He did? That was some feat." Guards could be seen moving about inside the little wooden building. "Was it empty at the time?" "I'm not sure. He might have hidden it in the grass on the outside. We'll leave that one. The guards can look after themselves." Anyone carrying a weapon was fair game as far as she was concerned. "All right. Madog put a couple in that big marquee, the one that looks like it's set up for shows." She could see the one he meant. An open-fronted structure, it was covered by cloth bearing odd symbols and designs. "Okay, let's see if we can find them." They did. Madog had hidden the incendiaries in amongst a pile of acting equipment. They were easily visible in the costumes and props, but he must have predicted no one would be using them until later in the day. Certainly, the miscellaneous items would create quite a conflagration. The noises of the gathering crowd were growing louder. They hadn't collected even half the devices yet. They were running out of time. "We have to go faster," said Mark. "It won't be long before my brothers are here with the remote detonator. They've probably already woken up and noticed we're missing." He was right. The damage to his relationship with his brothers was done by now, and Taylan's heart ached with regret. The last thing she'd wanted was to drive a wedge between them. "We'll have to accept we won't get them all," she said. "We'll get as many as we can, then leave before sunup." That was the moment Mylir would set off the incendiaries. It was a clear morning, and the patch of sun where the sun would rise was glowing faintly golden. "Where do we go next?" she asked. He peered around the site. "Yeah, this way." She followed him. Over the next 15 minutes, they gathered another 6 devices. But the crowd was growing so thick it was becoming a crush, and Taylan felt extremely vulnerable. They had attracted some curious glances, and she couldn't speak with a Crusader accent like Mark could. "Okay," she said, thrusting an incendiary into her pack as they stood at the back of a pavilion. "We're done. Let's go." "No, we have time to get a couple more," said Mark. "It's at least 10 minutes until sunrise." "It's less than that, and even if we did have 10 minutes, it's still too risky. We need to get out of here before the incendiaries we didn't get go off. When that happens, the Crusaders will be looking for someone to blame, and we stand out too much." "Just one more then. I remember there's one really close by. It'll only take—" "No!" But after a second's hesitation, he left her, striding away through the crowd. "Mark!" she called, then immediately cringed as people looked in her direction. "Mark!" she whispered. "Damn it!" She took off after him. Beyond the edge of the crowd, in the green fields that led to the hedgerows, walked 3 tall, dark-haired men. They would have been noticeable if anyone had been taking any notice, but the Crusaders were fixated on what was about to happen. Throngs of people were making their way closer to Bryn Celli D, hastening to be near the sacred site as the midsummer sun breasted the horizon. Where was Mark? She'd taken her eyes off of him for a moment, and now she couldn't see him. There were too many people about. He was cutting it too fine. Mylir and the others were on their way. They had to have guessed she and Mark had been removing the incendiaries. Would they try to set them off regardless, knowing the risks? "Where are you, you stupid kid?" She rushed forward. A woman bumped into her. "Watch out! Be more careful!" The woman pulled her shawl tighter and hurried on her way. The murmuring of the crowd was growing louder. Crusaders surged around the mound like waves on a stormy night. All heads faced one direction, east. Taylan didn't hear the incendiaries go off. What she heard first was a scream. Then there was a shout, louder than the chattering hum of the masses of people. "Fire!" But someone else was screaming, shrieking in agony. Taylan flew toward the noise, knocking aside everyone in her way. A figure stumbled from a pavilion, engulfed in flames. She threw herself on him, wrapping him in her arms, rolling over and over on the wet grass. But the fire wouldn't go out. It clung to her, searing her. She smelled her own hair burning. She was vaguely aware of people surrounding them, gawping in horror, and, farther off, cries of alarm. Why didn't someone do something? Were they just going to let them burn? Something heavy landed on her, something wide and soft that covered her and Mark entirely, turning the world dark. Hands pressed down. The blanket was smothering her. She couldn't breathe, but the flames had been extinguished. She was still holding Mark. Squirming in her arms, he moaned in pain. Chapter 35. Hans had been watching the harbour for several days, watching and waiting. Leaving Jamaica had proven harder than he'd thought it would be. Much to his surprise, he'd seen posters bearing his face appear around Kingston, stating that anyone knowing his whereabouts was to report to the country's interim government, the resistance leaders. Luckily, the only image they had of him was from his days as head of CIS. His appearance had altered considerably since then. What had surprised him was the vindictiveness of Charles, Devon and the rest of them in seeking him out after he'd disappeared. It was as if they were looking for someone to blame for the state of things. No one was to blame. It was just that circumstances weren't right for what they wanted to achieve. They'd aimed too high, been too unrealistic. They had to walk before they could run, but they wouldn't have listened if he'd tried to tell them. He hugged his cloth bag to his chest as he squatted in the bushes that fringed the quay. He needed to take his next step very carefully. If he got it wrong, he would be given up to the resistance, or his throat would be cut and he would be dumped in the sea. The wealth he was holding was more than the fisherman could expect to earn over several lifetimes. He needed someone willing to take him off the island for a generous fee, but not so corrupt as to kill him for whatever else he might be carrying. The harbour side was busy as the ship's captains and crews arrived and prepared the boats for that night's fishing. Vessels of all kinds bobbed in the water, from massive automated commercial shrimpers to small independent boats that probably fished whatever they could find in the rapidly depleting seas. Of all the people who frequented the place, Hans had focused on an older woman who fished alone. She seemed to mostly catch lobsters and crabs, going out daily to haul the pots and refresh the bait. She was friendly with all the folk she met, but she kept to herself. Her age and gender made her less likely to murder him, he hoped, while she looked poor enough to be tempted to help a wanted man for a reward. It was about the time she was due to return with that day's catch. Hans shifted a little to ease his aching muscles. Was that her? A smallish boat was heading for the harbour, its engine loud despite the distance. It was her. He stood and lifted the strap of his bag over his head so it sat across his chest. After several days living rough, he stank. He hated being dirty almost as much as he hated being hungry and thirsty and having nowhere comfortable to sleep. But perhaps his situation was about to change. When the boat had softly bumped into the harbour wall and the woman had climbed out to secure it with loops of rope, Hans stepped from his hiding place. Checking that no one was looking his way, he crossed the stone quayside and went up to her. She was bending over a cleat. She saw his shoes first. Her gaze travelled up his body to his face. She stared at him blankly. Good. She hadn't recognised him from the posters. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm looking for someone to take me. I'll be frank. I need a boat to take me out of the Caribbean. But if that's too far for your liking, passage to another island would be sufficient." The woman straightened up and put a hand on her hip. She glanced behind her and all around before replying, "You talking to me?" "Yes, I can pay, of course, though not in creds. Gold. These days I'd say that was a more reliable currency, wouldn't you?" "You want me to what?" "I'd like you to take me off Jamaica. Now. I know you've only just brought in your catch, but I can compensate you for whatever it's worth." His nerves were starting to get to him. If they continued talking much longer, someone was bound to wonder what was happening and come over to find out. "If the answer's no, that's fine, but I need you to decide." She held eye contact with him, unblinking. "I can see I've taken up enough of your time," said Hans, turning. No, she objected. "Where you going? I'm still thinking." Tense with stress, he faced her again. "You want to get off the island?" "I do," he agreed, adding unnecessarily, "That's exactly what I want." "Hey, Hester!" someone shouted. "You have a good day?" Ignoring the man, she said to Hans,
What you waiting for? Come aboard." She began to unhitch the ropes. Paradoxically, a fresh outpouring of sweat coated him as he relaxed, finally assured he would escape. He grabbed the bow of the boat for security and swung a leg over the side. "Wait a minute," said Hester. "I want to see that gold before we set off." "No problem." Hans dug into his pocket and produced the 3 solid gold antique coins he'd put there to avoid revealing his hoard. Hester's eyebrows rose and she held out her hand palm upward. Hans placed one of the coins on it. She bit the shiny metal and inspected the dent, while Hans had the strangest feeling he was in a holodrama. After tucking the coin into a strip of cloth wrapped around her waist, she continued to untie the rope. "Who's that fella?" her acquaintance asked, coming closer. He was a tall fellow in his later years, more bones and skin than meat, and gap-toothed. "He your boyfriend? I'm jealous." Hester replied in patois, telling him to shut up and mind his own business. Hans sat in the stern of the boat and watched, concerned the newcomer would attract more attention and someone might recognize him. The man didn't leave, however. His expression switched from mild curiosity and amusement to a keener interest. Narrowing his eyes, he scrutinized Hans, who wished he could flip over the side of the boat like a scuba diver. But there was nothing he could do except wait for his ride to finish completing her slow preparations to leave. She was done. She climbed into her vessel with surprising nimbleness for her age and started the engine. The old man on the quay beckoned the other fishermen and invited them to come and see Hester's new boyfriend. He sounded like he was joking, but Hans detected a layer of suspicion and excitement beneath his words. Hester piloted her boat in a curve, taking them out to sea. Her gaze on the water, she shouted over the noisy engine, "You're that man in the posters, right?" His chest tightened. There was no point in denying it. Hester had guessed the truth, yet she was helping him anyway. "I am," he said. "I hope that isn't a problem." She thrust out her lower lip as she considered. "No, it don't matter," she said in the end. "I mind my business and no one else's. It's the best way." She smiled a lazy smile. Hans did a double take. Reaching into his shirt pocket, he pulled out a photograph and looked at it before regarding Hester again. "Tell me," he said, "do you have any children?" "No, I've been single all my life. Why you asking?" "It's not important." He watched the green island shrinking as the boat drew away. An engine noisier than Hester's attracted his attention in the opposite direction. A gleaming white ship was parting the waves, sea foam streaming from her prow. An Alliance battleship. The Jamaican resistance had caved and accepted BA help. In return, they'd given up their country's independence. Chapter 36. It was dusk, 3 days after midsummer, and Wright was watching Merlin as he settled down cross-legged on a high hilltop. The alien closed his eyes and breathed in deeply. Meanwhile, Arthur wandered to a drop and stood at the edge, hand on sword hilt. Wright would have objected to the alien's decision to go to this exposed location, but they were in the middle of nowhere. Despite their high elevation, no buildings were visible as far as the eye could see, and they hadn't encountered another soul since yesterday morning when they'd spied someone riding a trail bike in the distance.
Ellis would be coming back from the festival, and they had to find her before she passed them on her way to the Brizeli Hills hideout. In the vast tracts of wild, mountainous countryside, it seemed an impossible feat, but Merlin appeared confident they would do it. He'd mentioned something about patterns converging and things playing out. Arthur had simply accepted the alien's pronouncements and followed him like a shaggy dog, a dog that could turn vicious in the right circumstances. Wright had felt powerless to do anything else except go along too. He did hope they could find Ellis, though he hated the prospect of persuading her to return with him to the Gallant and carry out Merlin's plan. It would be good to see her again. He found an area of flat outcrop and sat on it, wondering how long the alien would take to home in on Ellis, if that was what he was doing. He could be communicating with his extraterrestrial masters for all anyone knew, sending them the message that Earth civilizations were so busy warring with each other the planet was ripe for taking. Wright rubbed the top of his head. At that lofty position the wind blew strong and cool, finding every entry point in his clothes. To pass the time he opened his pack and checked his supplies. Another couple of days of food was all that remained. Water was easy to find, but they would start feeling hungry soon. Arthur had supplemented their diet with rabbits, but he hadn't had time to trap many, and the animals had no fat and little meat on them. It was a good thing the alien ate nothing. After watching the darkening landscape for 20 minutes, he grew cold and stiff. He stood up and stretched. Merlin hadn't changed position, but Arthur had disappeared. Wright walked to the drop and peered over it. He couldn't see any sign of the king among the rough scrub that clung to the steep slope. "I think I may have found her." Wright nearly leapt off the precipice. "Don't sneak up on me like that," he scolded Merlin, whose soft voice he'd heard next to his ear. "But we'll have to be quick," the alien went on, as if Wright hadn't spoken. "She's already past us, and she'll be hard to see in the dark." "Great. Where's Arthur?" As he spoke, the king's figure appeared striding into sight at the other end of the hilltop. "Do you have her, Merlin? I spied out an obvious route through the hills. We've been making things hard for ourselves, taking a difficult path." "Excellent," the alien replied. "Do you see what I mean now about patterns converging, Major?" Wright grunted a response. "We need to descend this way," Arthur said. They followed a thread-like trail down the high hill, made even harder to discern by the rapid falling of the light. It was a starry night, but the moon hadn't risen yet. Merlin went first, setting a rapid pace. Wright wondered how far they had to go to catch up to Ellis, and what he would say if they did find her somehow. At the foot of the hill, Arthur took the lead and walked no less quickly than Merlin. Wright was last in the line of 3, as had become the norm over the days they had spent together. He struggled a little to keep up, partly because he was already tired from the day's trek, and partly because reluctance was dragging at his feet. They traversed the valley, passing the hills on each side. Wright began to lose his sense of the passage of time. His world narrowed down to the almost invisible track, the 2 men ahead of him, and the slowly wheeling stars above. Every so often Arthur would call out things like, "This way," and "I think we go left here," but otherwise no one spoke. Then Wright heard Merlin mutter, "I hope we haven't missed her." A moment later he said louder, "Arthur, are you sure we haven't lost our way?" "I don't think so," came the king's reply. "Should we stop and shout for her? The hills will carry the echo, and I doubt there are many enemies about." "No,"
said Wright. "It's too dangerous, even out here. I say we continue walking. She might be nowhere near."
"Major Wright?" asked a soft female voice. Someone stepped out from the shadows between rocks on the side of the trail.
"Taylan!" Arthur exclaimed. "We found you at last."
He stepped closer to her, but she shrank from his approach and took a small detour around him to reach Wright. "I heard people coming down the track. I never guessed it would be you."
"Ellis!"
His first impulse was to hug her, but that wouldn't be appropriate. Also, she was hunched over.
"Are you okay?"
"Not really. What are you all doing? And how the hell did you find me? Has Colburn been tracking my implant?"
"No, that wouldn't be safe."
"You're telling me."
"Are you—"
He peered at her face, half hidden by her hood.
"Have you been hurt?"
"Yeah, but you still haven't told me what you're doing here. Have you really come all this way just to find me?"
"It'll take a while to explain. Let's make camp somewhere, and I'll lay it out for you."
Ellis looked at Arthur and Merlin, appearing uncertain. She clearly hadn't forgotten her changed impression of the king, and she'd never liked the alien. Wright realised she hadn't revealed herself until after he had spoken, though she must have recognised all their voices. She wouldn't have come out of her hiding place if it had only been the other two. "Can you give me the short version?" she asked.
"Merlin wants you to help us try to kill the Dwyr again."
That was the short version, but if he told her that, she'd probably unleash the same response she'd given Colburn via comm.
"I'd prefer it if we could talk for a while. Do you need food? We have some to share, though it's not much."
"I have plenty of food." She sighed, and he caught a flash of cool grey eyes meeting his gaze. "All right. I suppose it won't hurt to hear you out." As they walked to find a spot suitable to spend the night, Wright noticed Taylan was moving as though she was in pain. Then, when they sat down together, he got a better look at her face. He gasped. The right-hand side of it was blistered, swollen, and weeping, and her right eye was only partially open. And though he couldn't see well under her hood, it seemed her hair on that side had been burned to her scalp.
"What happened to you?"
"That's another long explanation. Let's do yours first."
"Taylan, you must be in pain," said Arthur. "Let Merlin heal you before we talk."
She hesitated. "No, I'll be okay."
"Those are third-degree burns, Ellis," said Wright. "If you don't have them treated, they'll get infected. I don't know how you can walk around with an injury like that."
She gave a slight smile, and he understood he'd put on his major voice. "I want to hear what you have to say," she said. He silently cursed, though he couldn't blame her for insisting. He had a feeling the moment he told her Merlin's plan, that would be the last he would see of her.
"Okay, but hear me out before you come to a decision. And even if you don't like what I have to say, promise me you'll stay with us tonight and let us help you."
"No, I'm not promising anything." She glanced at Merlin and Arthur.
"Oh, well."
He'd tried his best. He told her about the proposal to cloak the Gallant and approach the Dwyr's flagship with the intent of boarding it and assassinating her. He left out the part about it being Merlin's idea. There was no point in making it even more likely she would refuse. To his surprise, she didn't immediately say no. Another thing struck him. She clearly hadn't found her children. He was sure she wouldn't have undertaken the task of sabotaging the Crusaders' festival if that had been the case.
"What happened at the midsummer celebration?" he asked.
"I'd rather not talk about it."
"It didn't work out?"
Ignoring his question, she said, "This plan of yours, I'm prepared to consider it, but on one condition." Chapter 37. Kala was determined not to make the same mistake twice. She'd asked the Belladonna's chief medical officer to supply her with sedatives, claiming she found it hard to sleep. That had been easy. Crushing up a couple of the tablets and mixing them into Perrin's evening drink had been harder, but she'd managed it without him or Morgan noticing. The drug would take effect slowly, but once her son was asleep, he wouldn't wake for another 7 or 8 hours, no matter what. By then she hoped to be far from her usurper's sphere of influence. All she needed was for the rest of her efforts over the last couple of weeks to bear fruit. Luckily, Morgan hadn't restricted her movements around the ship or removed her security access. Perhaps she'd underestimated Kala or was uninterested in how things worked aboard the starship. Lying in bed, waiting for the hours to pass, was the hardest part. Kala's muscles ached with tension. This might be her only and final chance to outwit Morgan. If she failed, who knew what the woman would do in retaliation this time around? But what choice did she have? She couldn't live under another's rule. She'd spent her entire life ensuring she was the one with the power, the one in control. She couldn't allow another to stand in her way. Her entire being rebelled against the notion. It was time. As she had before on her first attempt to leave, she rose and went silently to Perrin's cabin. She'd worked out the best route for avoiding other people. She mostly trusted her crew, who seemed to remain loyal to her whenever Morgan wasn't around, but she couldn't take even the smallest risk. Perrin lay with his mouth open, sleeping heavily. She didn't waste time gathering any of his belongings. He would probably complain about it when he woke up, but she would find a way to mollify him. Enduring his anger and disappointment when he realised she'd taken him away from Morgan was a small price to pay for their freedom from the tyrant. She uncovered him and slipped her arms under his sleeping form. With some difficulty, she lifted him and put him over her shoulder to help support his weight. It had been several years since she'd carried him like this. The feeling brought back happy memories of him as a small boy, when he'd been young enough to sit on her lap and cuddle her. Something in her heart seemed to twist, and she found herself swallowing tears. She would not allow that bitch to take her son away from her. His cabin door slid aside and she carried him into the passageway. Selecting and preparing the crew members who would help her had been a long and difficult process. First, she had to approach the person in question while Morgan was not around. This had proven hard to do because Morgan had insisted they spent most of their time together. Not that she'd continued to instruct Kala in the skills she possessed. No, that privilege was now reserved for Perrin only. Instead, Morgan had seemed to take a special pleasure in forcing her to attend her son's lessons and witness a process that was now off limits to her. Consequently, she'd spent little time alone. Next, she had to subtly question them to assess whether they would be able or willing to help her. This had been where she'd feared things going wrong the most. All it would have taken was one of the people she approached to tell Morgan what she was attempting, and she would have found herself back in the brig, or worse. Then she'd put together the steps of her escape and relayed the information to the trusted individuals. The harrowing procedure had taken weeks. The shuttle bay hatch appeared in the passageway ahead of her. She'd managed to reach it without encountering anyone else. Her co-conspirators had kept her path empty. The hatch opened at her approach. No problems with the security lockout. Wonderful. Finding a pilot to take her to Earth had been nearly impossible, unsurprisingly given what had happened to the last one. Eventually, an older man who had worked for her for years had agreed. She had yet to think of a worthy reward for him when they reached their destination, but it would be something highly valuable, plus a sizable pension. The pilot waited outside the shuttlecraft as instructed. She wasn't going to take the same risk as before. When she and Perrin were ready, he would step inside and start the engines. Then she would fly to freedom. She climbed aboard and put Perrin in the nearest seat, quickly fastening his seatbelt. She checked the pilot's cabin. It was empty. "It's safe," she called out to him before taking a seat herself. As she strapped in, she heard the pilot's door close. A soft rumble coursed through the vessel as the engines fired. Just another couple of minutes. She could hardly believe she was nearly free. The shuttle lifted and hung in midair for a second, then she felt a gentle pressure as it moved forward. The bay bulkheads passed by on each side. Black space appeared, speckled with the hard silver points of stars. She'd done it. They were away. Unless Morgan realised she'd escaped in the next hour or so, she would find it hard to come after her. And would she want to risk a battle with Perrin aboard the shuttle? Kala didn't think so. Perrin was the last of her descendants. She wouldn't want to risk hurting him. Kala relaxed and looked at her sleeping son. He would get over not seeing Morgan anymore. He'd only known her a few months, and she would make sure to spoil him to help him forget. She'd decided to return to the castle she'd lived at before her most recent habitation. Morgan had never been there. She'd never met any of the staff, and so hadn't had the opportunity to influence them. It was conceivable that she would try to raise an army to attack her, but outside of Kala's immediate retinue, hardly anyone in the EAC had seen her. She had no reputation, no influence other than over people in her immediate vicinity, and little experience of the world. She might be hard to kill. Kala hadn't given up on her plan to discover Morgan's enemy, but that didn't mean she was to be feared forever. She might only continue as an impotent irritation, a gnat to be swatted away when she got too close. Kala closed her eyes as her tension eased some more. She'd been on edge for weeks. Telling the doctor she was unable to sleep had been no lie. She breathed deeply and focused on the smooth motion of the shuttle as it carried her away from her deadly foe. A short time later, she opened her eyes again. On darkness. She jerked to full awareness, her eyes stretching wide. Why was it dark? In her panic, she grabbed her armrests, but there was nothing for her to hold. Her seat had disappeared too. She was floating without support in a void. "Pilot! Pilot! Answer me!" Silence. "Perrin! Perrin, where are you?" She reached out, but her hands met nothing. Her feet did the same. Where was she? Where had the shuttle gone? Where was Perrin? Was she dreaming? An icy claw of fear clutching her heart, she prayed it was only a nightmare, that she would wake up aboard the Belladonna, her escape plan still in place. On the edge of her hearing, she heard a soft, familiar chuckle. Chapter 38. Taylan watched Merlin and Arthur disappear into the night. When she couldn't see them anymore, she said to Wright, "I never thought he would agree to it. Merlin, he badly wants to carry out his plan for some reason.
I'm not sure why. Oops.
He gave her a sheepish look.
It's okay. I'd already figured out this was all his idea. I didn't think you liked me so much you would trek for days through the wilds of West Bi, enemy territory, just to find me. Now he looked a little hurt. What makes you think I don't like you? I wasn't that bad a CO to you, was I?
No, that isn't what I meant. You have to admit this is excessive. There has to be 1,000 other Marines who would be just as good as me at trying to take out the Dwyr.
Not 1,000. 100 maybe. 10 at least.
She smiled, then winced and raised her hand to the side of her face.
I wish you'd let Merlin treat you before he left.
She shook her head, then winced again.
I wish I would stop doing that. You must be in a lot of pain. Hey, I forgot. I brought along some meds.
He fished in his pack and handed her a strip of blisters that was nearly empty. But you've been using these, she said. You must need them. I can't take them.
I don't need them as much as you do. Go on, please. It would make me feel better.
Her burns did hurt like a bitch, keeping her awake at night and making every movement painful. She popped one of the pills and swallowed it with a sip of water.
No luck with your kids? He asked quietly.
About to shake her head again, she remembered just in time.
No.
There was so much more she could have told him on that front, about spying on the orphanage and getting shot, and her guess that Patrin and Kayla might have been taken in by a Crusader couple, but she didn't think she could do it. No luck was all she could manage. He got the hint and didn't press her to tell him more.
How long do you think it'll be before Arthur and Merlin come back?
About a day and a half. She'd set out at the same time as the brothers, but they were moving much slower than her due to carrying Mark on a stretcher. It had been an enormous relief when Merlin had agreed to heal Mark in return for her participation in the mission. The guilt of his injuries had weighed heavy on her, even though he'd insisted on helping her remove the incendiaries. If she hadn't been at the festival and objected to the sabotage, he wouldn't have got hurt. He'd been fortunate to survive the horrible burns from the device going off in his hands. He could have easily died, and she would have had to live with the fact for the rest of her days. She had plenty of regrets already, without adding another to the list.
It looks like we'll have quite a wait ahead of us, said Wright. Are you hungry? Do you want to eat something? I could start a fire if you're cold too. I think it'll be safe out here.
Now that the meds were taking effect, she had felt her appetite begin to return. I have lots of food. She hadn't touched her supplies since leaving Anise Morn. You should have some of mine, and a fire would be great. As the Major went to gather wood, she took out some of the parcels the Crusaders had given her and opened them. She found strips of preserved meat, dried fruit, savoury biscuits, some kind of confectionery, and nuts in their shells. The people had been so kind and generous. The memory of them filling her pack before she set off brought tears to her eyes. It had been so odd. They hadn't seemed to guess she and Mark might have had something to do with the fires that had simultaneously broken out at the festival site. Mark, being a victim of one of the fires, probably had something to do with that. They hadn't appeared to recognise the deactivated incendiaries in her pack, perhaps unremarkably, if anyone who saw them had no military experience. Retrieving the majority of the devices had meant the few fires that had started up were dealt with before things got out of control. She and Mark had prevented a terrible disaster, so that was something to be grateful for. But Mark had suffered horribly, and she'd lost Meilir and Madog's friendship forever. Not Medwyn's, he had never liked her anyway. Regarding the other two, if they'd felt any animosity toward her because she'd upset their plans, involving their brother so he was left severely burned, had put the seal on it. She would never be able to look either of them in the eyes again. Wright walked into the campsite and dropped a bundle of sticks. "There's plenty of wood about. We should have enough to keep a fire going all night." With that, he set off to find some more. When he returned and added to the bundle, he started a small fire. "Here," she said, "have one of these." She handed him a candy and popped one in her own mouth too. "What do you think it is?" He chewed. "No idea. Is it a West BI speciality?" "No, I got it from a crusader." "You're kidding. How come?" "Sit down. I'll tell you what happened at the festival." When he was sitting next to her, she asked, "What do I call you now?" "Huh? Unless you still want me to call you Major Wright." "Oh, TJ will do." "TJ, that's it. That's what Arthur calls you. What do the initials stand for?" "Nothing very interesting." "Don't worry, you can tell me. Is it something embarrassing?" "No." It was something embarrassing. "You were going to explain what happened at the festival," said Wright. "Smooth change of subject there," Taylan replied. "I like it." She took another piece of candy out of the packet. "Okay, where do I start?" She told him about the four brothers, Angharad's sons, and their scheme to ruin the Crusader celebration. She told him about her realization and Mark and everything that had happened. Some parts she'd only found out later, like the fact that when the time came to trigger the incendiaries, Meilir and Medwyn had argued and then fought. Meilir had wanted to abandon the plan, guessing she and Mark were in danger, while Medwyn had wanted to go ahead with it anyway. Medwyn had managed to grab the remote detonator and press it. The final part, after Crusaders had extinguished the flames on her and Mark, was hazy. She'd been too shocked and agonized to register much. The people had cared for them. Maybe it had been due to Mark's earlier conversation with the Crusader outside the admissions tent. They'd been identified as part of the crowd. She really didn't know. But people had gently cleaned the sticky oil from their burned skin, dressed their wounds, and given them clothes to replace their ruined ones. Somewhere along the way, the brothers must have noticed what was going on and had claimed Mark as their own. She had also left the Crusaders soon after, using her damaged airways as an excuse not to speak. All in all, despite everything that had happened, she was glad she'd done what she had. She only wished she'd managed to persuade Mark to stay away. She finished her story, and silence fell. The Major seemed reluctant to comment on her experiences with the Crusaders. "I'd prefer to call you Wright, if that's okay." "You can call me whatever you like. You should bed down for the night. It can't have been easy walking for days with those wounds. Keep the meds, I can do without them. But when Merlin gets back, I want you to let him heal you." She gave a shiver. "I hate the idea of that creepy alien touching me." "That's perfectly reasonable. Who wouldn't? But we have a long journey to make to reach the Gallant, and you won't be going far or fast in that condition." She yawned. "Yes, sir. A compliant Marine. That's what I like. Hey, who said anything about re-enlisting?"
Just joking. Besides, are you sure the Alliance wants you back?
Huh, they'd be lucky to have me.
They would, and that isn't a joke.
She unrolled her sleeping bag, took off her jacket and climbed inside, her handmade Crusader clothes feeling awkward and bulky, especially now the Major's painkillers were working. As she settled down, the warmth and happiness she'd felt since encountering Wright began to fade. Patrin and Kayla remained lost, and she could never return to the Westby Isles Resistance. If it hadn't been for the mission Merlin had dreamed up, she would have been entirely alone and friendless in a land ruled by someone who wanted her dead. In truth, she'd had little choice about accepting Wright's proposal. Chapter 39. It was during the journey back to the Gallant, Wright decided to tell Ellis the information Merlin had revealed. She was wearing one of the suits stowed aboard the dropship in case of emergencies, which meant he could open a one-to-one comm with her and Merlin and Arthur wouldn't overhear. He knew she would believe him. Her opinion of him hadn't been coloured by his psych assessment report, as every senior Marine officer's would be from now on. Also, he had a feeling she would have believed him anyway, no matter what any shrink said. She suspected Merlin just as much as he did, and a new level of trust had developed between them.
So, there are extraterrestrial powers interfering in Earth affairs, he concluded. If you believe him.
Whoa. She took a moment to process, then said, "Makes sense, or it's some kind of explanation for what's going on. What he's doing here, I mean. Why he's so invested he returned after thousands of years when Arthur woke up. That's a big commitment, right?"
Who knows what's a big commitment in his terms? He told me something else that was interesting. I asked him about the alien who accompanies the Dwyr. I said, why aren't we trying to kill her? He replied it would be like trying to kill a rock.
A rock? She didn't look anything like a rock when I saw her. She did the cloud thing, like he does.
I suppose it's his way of saying she couldn't be killed. I don't know. It was the usual Merlin obfuscation.
Do you think the Dwyr's alien is controlling her the way Merlin controls Arthur? Taylan asked.
I thought about it, but I've never read any reports about her having a sidekick. She always seemed to be acting alone.
Maybe her alien returned to Earth the same time as Merlin. Maybe that's who snatched the Fearless.
Yeah, Wright agreed. You could be right. But why wouldn't he tell us? Why allow suspicion to fall on him?
Because he's an asshole who enjoys playing with us.
You're spot on there.
Predictably, Colburn demanded they all reported to her office the moment they set foot on the Gallant. Wright led the way, his knee bothering him again. He hoped the higher-ups would allow them some time to recuperate before attempting the assault on the Belladonna. When they arrived, Lieutenant General Carroll was there too. He and the Brigadier were standing behind her desk, apparently presenting a united front about something.
"Excellent work, Major," said Carroll. "Thank you, sir."
"No, thank you for bringing Corporal Ellis back into the fold."
"Corporal?"
said Taylan. "No, I was discharged. I'm just plain Ellis now." Colburn coughed. "As I explained when we contacted you a few weeks ago, Major Wright made an error. You are not discharged. Lieutenant General Carroll and I thought we should make that clear so there's no misunderstanding. You still have—" "No, I'm not a Royal Marine. I only agreed to come back and take part in this mission because Wright asked me. I'm doing you a favour. I'm not working for you guys anymore."
She turned to stare at Wright accusingly. "No one told me about this," he said to Colburn and Carol. Of course they hadn't told him. He wouldn't have agreed to find her and persuade her to come back if he'd known what they had planned. They probably wanted to control her in the way they couldn't control Arthur or Merlin. They probably saw her as a valuable asset, but they were skating on thin ice. Neither of them understood how much Ellis hated being a Marine. "The information wasn't relevant at the time," Carol said. "But I thought you understood the discharge you gave was invalid. Your rank does not confer the necessary authority. I'm surprised you are unaware of that." "This is complete rubbish," Ellis exclaimed. "Fine, I won't do your mission. What are you going to do, make me?" "If you refuse a direct order," Colburn warned, "you'll be court-martialed." "Fine, put me in the brig. I could do with a rest, to be honest. I'm fucking exhausted." "Do not use that language in front of a senior officer," barked the brigadier. "Taylan," Wright interjected, "one of the outcomes of court-martial is execution." "They could murder me? How bloody dumb is that? Yeah, kill your own personnel. Fantastic idea. It's not surprising the Alliance is barely holding its own in the war when it has morons like you two running it." Merlin chuckled. Colburn was pale with anger. "You will be silent!" "Brigadier," said Carol, "if I could say something?" He turned to Ellis. "What do you say we wind back the last few minutes and start again? I can see you feel strongly about the situation. I'll go so far as to say perhaps we underestimated just how strongly you would feel. It's an easy mistake to make when we're operating with insufficient information." He glanced at Wright. Great. Carol expected him to shoulder the blame for Ellis's justified outrage. "Our problem is," the Lieutenant General continued, "we need you and the Major here to represent the Alliance in this mission." "Why?" asked Ellis. "Why can't I be whatever you count them as?" She gestured at Arthur and Merlin. That's somewhat difficult to explain," Carol replied. "Suffice to say, at least 50% of the core team responsible for the Dwyr's assassination should belong to the Alliance." It was a political thing, Wright guessed. If it had got out that the BA had little or nothing to do with the defeat of the EAC, it would look bad. The Alliance was concerned about its reputation and ongoing influence in world affairs when the war was over. "Can I suggest something?" he asked. "Go ahead, Major," said Carol. "What if you give Ellis a guarantee of her discharge as soon as the mission is over?" "If I'm still alive," she muttered. Colburn gave Carol a look. Her desire to shoot down the possibility was almost palpable. "I'd have to think about how to organise that within current regulations," Carol replied. "But I'm willing to consider the request." "Generous of you," said Ellis. Wright winced. "Even if you give me a guarantee," she went on, "how am I to know you won't renege on it later? I was given a discharge once, now everyone's backtracking on that. If we arrange for a guarantee of some kind, it would be legally binding." "I could sue you? Come on, it's wartime." "Believe me," said Carol, "it isn't in our interests to have Marines who don't want to fight." "It seems the Major's identified a potential way forward," Merlin said. "Why don't we all take some time to think about it?" "That sounds like a splendid idea." Carol clapped his hands together. "You must all be tired after your long journey, exhausted even." He smiled at Ellis. "Rest a while, and we'll see what we can come up with." As they walked away from Colburn's office, Ellis wouldn't make eye contact with Wright. "I had no idea they were going to pull that stunt," he said. "As far as I knew, your discharge had gone through." "Yeah, okay," she replied, but she didn't sound convinced. Chapter 40. The offer had arrived at Taylan's cabin interface, 2 lines of text undersigned by Carol and the new Chief of Defence Staff. The Lieutenant General had gone to the top, probably in an effort to persuade her. They really wanted her to be a Marine, for a short time anyway. If she accepted, her discharge would take effect after the completion of her upcoming assignment. Along with the proposal came details of her personal file system and security permissions. Preempting her acceptance of the terms of the agreement, she'd been added to the Gallant's database. Her files were empty. There was no sign of her vids. They were gone forever. Turning from the interface on her bedside table, she rolled onto her back. For the first time in her career as a Royal Marine, she had her own cabin. Cowell and Colburn really wanted her for this mission. And so did Merlin. No one had explained why. They'd sent Wright all the way to West BI, making him go on a long trek through the mountains with Merlin and Arthur to find her. How on earth they'd managed that, she wasn't clear. It had to be something to do with the alien. Then they'd all had to walk to the coast, sail to Ireland and fly up to the Gallant, when all the while some other Marine could have done the job just as well as her, with a lot less wasted time and inconvenience. What did it mean? Why was she so important? Maybe Wright knew. She should have asked him on their journey, but she'd been too preoccupied with worries and doubts about what she was doing. Maybe she would get an opportunity to ask him later, though she wasn't completely sure she trusted him. He was one of them, after all, a Royal Marine like Colburn and Carroll. She wasn't sure he had her best interests at heart. No, that wasn't right. She was sure he didn't. Before he'd found her, he hadn't known what had gone on since he left her at the Prezelli Hills hideout. He would have thought she was still searching for her kids, but he'd come to try and get her anyway. She'd thought he was a good guy, and he was, to an extent, but following orders always came first with him. She would have to be careful to never forget that. She couldn't trust anyone. She would have to look out for herself. On the other hand, she had the chance to put an end to the long war. If she succeeded in killing the Dwyr, the Britannic Isles would be free again. Things would begin to return to normal, and she might finally find Patrin and Kayla. She wouldn't have to figure out how to survive in a country where she could be shot on sight, and even the local resistance wouldn't have anything to do with her. In a funny way, it made her happy to think the Crusaders would be free too. Her experience at the Midsummer Festival had changed her perspective on them. Without a madwoman leading them, filling their heads with superstitions and delusions, they might see how wrong their beliefs were. They might be dragged into modern times. If the mission failed, she would probably die. If it succeeded, the Alliance wouldn't need her anymore. What did she have to lose? She turned onto her side, reached out to the interface, and accepted Carol's offer. Chapter 41. The Gallant had been fitted with massive clamps that would attach to the Belladonna's hull when she came alongside the flagship. The problem was that EAC's vessel was faster than the Gallant. When the Alliance Space Fleet troops tried to board her, she could simply pull away and rip off the umbilici. With the clamps in place, wherever she moved, she would take the Gallant with her.
It was one of the many new challenges the Alliance strategists had tried to anticipate and proactively solve. What the BA was attempting was a first in the history of space warfare. Up until then, boarding only took place when the opponent's ship was crippled. It was the final stage of battle that signalled impending victory. This time, the Space Fleet troops would attempt to board a fully working battleship, all its engines and weapons intact. The only thing working in their favour was the fact that the Belladonna would not be able to deploy any of her heavy armaments. As soon as the attack started, the EAC's other ships would come to the flagship's defence, but with only 50 metres between the Gallant and the Belladonna, neither would be in a position to target the other. Not only that, destroying another vessel at such close range would inevitably take out the attacker too. Not that Crusaders were averse to dying in preference to surrender. The thought brought back painful memories for Wright. He saw again the flash of light as the stadium in Kingston, full of EAC soldiers, exploded, heard the detonation, saw the unmoving bodies of the young men and women he'd been sent to collect. His orders were to report to the Psych Division once the attack on the Belladonna was over and undergo therapy. Only when he passed an evaluation would he be allowed to return to duty. No one ever stated it out loud, but it was generally accepted that a spell in a psych unit put an end to your military career. There would always be doubt over your reliability and mettle. At the very least, it would take years to clean the stain from his record and regain his superior's trust. Most likely, he would never receive another promotion. "I'm not okay with this," said Ellis. "Are you okay with this?" She was sitting in a crash seat next to him as the Gallant slid silently and invisibly closer to her target. "Okay with what?" he asked in reply. There were many aspects of the attack that brought him discomfort. "It doesn't seem right that others have to do the hardest, most dangerous bit while we sit on the sidelines." Boarding the Belladonna would inevitably result in high casualties. The Space Fleet soldiers would be forcing their way through the enemy's vessels' airlocks under heavy fire. Consequently, Ellis, Arthur, Merlin and he were under orders to wait until the ship's defences were broken through before they began their mission. Their roles were too important to risk their lives in the initial attack. "Everyone has to play their part," he replied, though he wondered how old the men and women were who would lose their lives that day. "If we all did exactly what we wanted, we'd never win a battle and more lives would be lost." "If we all did exactly what we wanted," she said, "probably half of us wouldn't even be here." He couldn't deny the truth of her comment. "What I don't understand is," she went on, "why they're using the Gallant in the attack. I mean, she isn't the biggest ship in the fleet, but she's up there. I know it'll take a lot of troops to fight the Belladonna's crew, but wouldn't it make more sense to use dropships? Why risk bringing one of our best battleships next to the EAC's most powerful vessel? If we lose, they'll have another great ship in their fleet." He explained the problem with the superiority of the Belladonna's engines, then also said, "Besides, no dropship is large enough to accommodate the cloaking device. It's massive. The engineers had to remove half the Gallant's weaponry and living quarters to fit it. That's why she couldn't take part in the Battle of the Brez. The remodelling took a year." "3 minutes to contact," came the general announcement. He closed his visor. Nearer the airlocks, the boarding troops waited. When the clamps had engaged, an umbilicus would extend from each airlock and attach to the Belladonnas. Sappers would use molecular scalpels to breach the hatches. Then the fighting would begin. Ellis leaned over to touch her helmet to his. "Have you ever seen such a weird couple?" She nodded toward Arthur and Merlin, who sat opposite them on the other side of the passageway. Arthur had been persuaded to forsake his chainmail and helmet and put on an armoured suit, but he hadn't given up his sword. He sat with it propped on the floor, point downward, both his hands resting on the hilt. Merlin was wearing his attire from the time he'd first appeared in human form, a red robe that extended to his feet and a black cap that covered most of his skull. He'd declined the offer of an EVA suit or any other protection against depressurization. Wright had to admit she had a point. 2 minutes to contact. You know, he said, I really didn't expect Carroll to insist you operate as a Marine for this. If I'd known what he and Colburn intended, I would have refused to try to find you. It's okay. I know how important your job is to you. She moved her helmet away. She didn't believe him, and he didn't know how to convince her. Patel loomed in his inner vision, and then his last sight of Elphick. Fuck. If Taylan died today, he would never forgive himself. 1 minute to contact. All the small movements of everyone around him ceased. Arthur had his head down. Was he praying? Merlin stared ahead, focusing on nothing. The seconds ticked away in silence. Then, over the comm, 10, 9, 8, 7. The Gallant had been slowing for ages. She came to an abrupt halt, jerking everyone in their seats. The clamps had grabbed the belladonna. The deck reverberated with the pounding of booted feet as the troops raced to the airlocks. Already, umbilici would be shooting out and latching onto the enemy vessel's hull. The scalpels would be through the thick barrier in no time. Then the hard fight would begin. Sitting and waiting was agony. All Wright could do was watch his HUD for the signal to move. A shockwave exploded down the passageway. A grenade had gone off. Was the enemy using them to detach the umbilici, or were the Alliance throwing them into the belladonna to clear entry to the ship? It was impossible to tell. His helmet picked up the distant whisper of pulse rifle fire and physical clash of armoured bodies. A Crusader appeared around a corner. One of them had broken through onto the Gallant. The man ran, confused, glancing over his shoulder, somehow cut off from his fellows. From his seated position, Wright aimed and fired. The round hit the soldier's chest, stopping him in his tracks. He looked down at the hole in his armour. Meanwhile, Wright had unfastened his harness and was walking toward the hostile. He fired again, hitting the same spot as before. The Crusader fell forward on his face. The body twitched a couple of times before it was still. Wright's actions had been automatic. See an enemy soldier, shoot to kill. He'd been doing it most of his adult life. Killing had become second nature to him, he realised. He seemed to see himself as if from a distance, standing over the dead Crusader. Then the signal flashed up. The belladonna's interior was a hazy, scorched mess. Alliance and EAC troops lay dead in passageways, and fighting continued in other areas of the ship. The vessel was not yet in the BA's hands, but this section was, for now. They couldn't afford to wait until the ship was secured to try to find the Dwyr. The Alliance might be repulsed, so they had to take their chance while they had it. As ordered, Wright led the search with Ellis, Arthur and Merlin following in their steps. They moved fast. The belladonna was a huge vessel. If they had to search her top to bottom, it would take hours. He guessed the Dwyr would probably be somewhere in the living quarters. She was either in a cabin or the bridge, but he didn't think she would have time to make it there after the attack began. She would be surrounded by a personal guard by now, no doubt. That was where Arthur would come in. The deck shook. Somewhere another grenade had gone off. Smoke puffed down the passageway and streamed into vents as the environmental control tried to clear it. The atmosphere readings on his HUD were going haywire. The ship was depressurizing, probably in multiple places. The clamps piercing her skull destroyed airlocks and detached umbilici. A knot of crusaders appeared ahead. Ellis fired and Wright joined in. Their pulses splashed over the enemy's suits. One fell. The hostiles moved to fire back, but something made them pause. They were looking past him and Ellis. After a moment's hesitation, abandoning their fallen comrade, they fled. Wright glanced back. Arthur was holding his sword aloft. His formidable presence, along with Merlin's odd garb, must have struck terror into them. The aliens' red robes were similar to the Dwyr's ceremonial costumes. They must have been disturbed and confused. "Major," Merlin said. "What?" "This way." Wright stopped and turned to face the alien. He was pointing at a passageway that branched off the main, heading starboard. "You can tell where she is?" "Not her, but someone I believe is with her." Exasperated, adrenaline making every nerve taut, Wright replied, "Whatever you say." Ellis's dark visor pivoted toward his, as if questioning his decision. He didn't like the idea of Merlin taking over either, but he was anxious to get the job done. The alien took the new route. Chapter 42. Fighting annoyance and reluctance every step of the way, Taylan followed Merlin through the Belladonna. Carrying out an assignment on the request of the Britannic Alliance was one thing, doing the aliens' bidding was another. But then, hadn't they been doing his bidding all along, under the guise of fulfilling the BA's aims? He'd been playing them all for fools, and she didn't know exactly why. The story Wright had told her about Merlin saying he represented powers who supported the Alliance didn't ring true. Her gut told her his demeanour didn't echo his words. Nevertheless, she didn't have much choice except to trudge along behind him. Arthur walked alongside the alien, his sword held defensively, while she and Wright regularly checked the rear. The chaotic situation aboard the ship meant threats could come from any angle. Merlin halted. A door slid open and 4 crusaders burst into the passageway. She lifted her rifle. Arthur swung. His sword moved in a wide arc, slicing into a man's bicep and continuing through into his chest. The king heaved the blade out and kicked his victim out of the way. He drove the point into another soldier's stomach, thrusting until the blade emerged from his back. The remaining 2 crusaders leapt out of his reach, retreating through the doorway. The door slid closed. 2 men lay dying in pools of blood, and neither she nor Wright had fired a shot. Merlin walked on. She'd been wondering how the king would fare against the Dwyr's troops. The crusaders he'd killed at the launch ceremony had been mostly unarmed and defenceless. Pulse fire might not affect him, but would he have any effect against suited-up soldiers? Her question had been answered. Wright opened a 1-to-1 comm. "I see what you mean about him." She replied, "You haven't seen anything yet." "Not far now," said Merlin over his shoulder. They strode around a corner. 5 troops stood abreast, blocking the passageway. More were gathered to their rear. "This is it," said Wright. "Good luck." Pulse bolts flew from the enemy's rifles. The energy spilled over Arthur and Merlin. Merlin was dissolving. As the Dwyr's female companion at the launch ceremony had, the alien was breaking apart, becoming translucent. Taylan fired back. Her rounds passed through the space containing the diffusing Merlin. His cloud began to fill the air around her, dark grey and billowing. Trying to ignore the distraction, she marched through it, firing round after round at the enemy. A pulse hit her. Agonizing heat emanated from the spot, and she stumbled. "Behind me, Taylan," Arthur ordered, taking a long step to get ahead of her. His arm was up, his elbow pointing back, and his sword held tip first as he stamped toward his foes. These ones did not flee in terror. She admired their bravery in the face of an attacker unaffected by pulse rounds, but she continued to fire, aiming around Arthur's bulk. Wright's pulses were also flying out. There could be only one conclusion. The Crusaders who remained standing by the time they reached them quickly fell to Arthur's sword. A closed door stood to the right. Behind it, no doubt, was the Dwyr and more of her guard. Movement at the end of the passageway caught Taylan's attention. She looked over just in time to see a woman and a boy disappearing around a corner. It was the Dwyr's companion from the launch ceremony, and the boy had been there too. Rumour said the Dwyr had a son. Taylan guessed that had to be him, and the woman was trying to take him to safety. Though a surviving successor to Dwyr Orr could mean trouble in days to come, she couldn't help feeling relieved he might get away. She could never have killed him, but she suspected Arthur might have in his berserker rage. "How do we get in?" she asked Wright. "There are a couple of possible ways," he replied. "I've let command know we've found her. They can send someone to cut through it, or if we have control of the ship, we can override the security." Arthur raised his sword. "Watch out," she warned Wright. Arthur plunged it into the security panel. The blade sank in several inches and the panel sparked and smoked. "Looks like he can't be electrocuted either," the Major remarked. "That won't work," he added, his comm now external. "Breaking the security will seal the door." The king wrenched the blade free, then, with a cry, holding the hilt in both hands, he sliced downward. Taylan's jaw dropped. The sword had actually pierced the door's surface. Arthur applied more pressure, forcing the sword in and down. He grunted, his elbows jutting as he worked the blade. He was cutting through the door. "Arthur," said Wright, touching the king's elbow. "Watch out," said Taylan, remembering the scar that remained on her neck from when Arthur had almost killed her. But the king seemed to hear him. "Take out your sword and step away," Wright instructed. She guessed the Alliance must have taken the ship and had told the Major they could unlock the door. Arthur's sword removed, a moment later the door slid open, though only halfway. The ridge the sword had created caught on the jamb. She was poised, waiting for the defensive fire from within. Nothing came. The room was dark. "Lights," said Wright. His command had no effect. Taylan switched her visor to night vision. The room was about 4 meters square and empty except for a bed. On the bed lay the figure of a woman, curled on her side in a fetal position. She was slim, and her long dark hair spread over her pillow. Was it the Dwyr? For a second, Taylan wondered if they'd been tricked with a decoy. The person on the bed looked very different from the figure she'd seen dressed in all her regalia. Could it really be her? And what was wrong with her? Why wasn't she getting up? Was she drugged? Could she be dead? Arthur was striding forward, his sword high. "Wait!" Taylan shouted, running in front of him. "Wait! I don't think it's the Dwyr." This time he didn't appear to hear. "Arthur, no!" She pushed his chest, slowing his progress. She couldn't see his face behind his visor, but she knew the blank stare he was likely wearing too well. "Right, help me!" She couldn't let Arthur murder an unarmed woman. The Major didn't move. "It's her." How did he know? She guessed his HUD had told him that his helmet was relaying his view of the Dwyr to the gallant. Arthur raised his sword. "No! Don't do it!" In part of Taylan's mind, she saw Dwyr Orr on the platform at the launch ceremony, lifting a knife to Kala's throat. She saw Wilson, his bloody, tortured body hanging upside down on the front of the Dwyr's conveyance, while the mad woman stood above him behind her protective barrier, the wind billowing out the cloth of her bizarre headdress. She heard the roar of her rabid supporters clamouring for his blood. In another part of her mind, crusaders were tending to her burns, giving her their clothes and food. She saw a crusader couple looking after her son and daughter, knowing they were from West Bi and not caring. There was a sound like air being sucked into a vacuum, and suddenly Merlin was there, standing in a corner of the room. "Don't let him kill her!" she yelled, not even sure why. The alien said nothing. She snatched for Arthur's sword arm. At the same time, she kicked his kneecap. It had no effect. She kicked again, summoning all her strength, while barely holding back the descending blade. His armoured leg bent backward just a little, but it was enough to halt his progress. The king was leaning over her, bringing his considerable weight to bear downward on her. She shouldered his chest, groaning with effort as she tried to unbalance him. If she could just get him down on the deck, if she could just get that sword out of his hand, he might come to his senses. But what chance did she stand with the alien right there controlling him? For long, strained seconds they were at stalemate. Her hand clamped his wrist, and her entire body's power was devoted to preventing the killing blow. It was not enough. Her muscles gave way, and, with the last of her strength spent, she collapsed. But she fell backward, over the motionless figure of the Dwyr. In another moment, she adjusted her position so she covered the woman's body with her own. She couldn't help it. Everything felt so wrong. Arthur's hand fastened on her shoulder. "Move, Taylan." "I won't. I can't." "You must." His head turned toward Merlin. Still, the alien said nothing. Arthur didn't bring down his sword. It hung over her, silver in the dark. But neither did he release her shoulder. Wright stood by, his rifle muzzle pointing to the side. He didn't seem to know what to do. Then Merlin said, "It is no matter. The new leader of the crusade has escaped on a shuttle. I suggest we take the former Dwyr and return to the Gallant." Chapter 43. In a remote cove on the coast of West Bi, a small boat bobbed on the waves. If it came any closer to the shore, it risked stranding itself on the sea bed. Aboard the boat, an argument was taking place. "You have to take me closer in," a middle-aged man insisted. "If I try to make it to the shore from here, I'll drown." "I told you," the boat's captain replied. "This is as far as I go. I can't help it that the tide's in, and I'm not going to wait until it goes out. It isn't safe. I've taken a big risk bringing you here." "I paid you a plentiful amount," said the middle-aged man. "Too much for you to dump me in the sea tens of meters from the coast." "I'm not dumping you anywhere. I can take you back to Ireland if you like. I'm going that way anyway." The captain grinned. "No, I don't want to go all the way back to Ireland. I've come this far." He paused, looking at the waves that lay between him and his destination. "There has to be a better place you can take me." "Sure, there are lots of spots. I could moor the boat and we could both step onto the quay, right into the hands of Crusader port officials. Now what's it to be? Are you getting out here, or am I taking you home with me?" His gaze dropped to the bag hanging from a strap that ran diagonally across the older man's chest. He was clearly wondering what the bag held. Perhaps it was more items similar to the heavy gold necklace he'd accepted in return for passage to Westby Eye. The man touched his bag protectively and took a step backward. There was no one else about, naturally. That was the whole idea. He needed to slip into Westby Eye unobserved, especially by anyone from the EAC. But it also meant if a murder were to be committed, there would be no witnesses. "So, back to Ireland it is," the captain said brightly. Despite his words, his gaze didn't leave the bag. "No," said his passenger. "No, I'll get out here." He glanced at the water. How deep was it? He was not a good swimmer. "Perhaps I'll only need to wade in." "Yes, perhaps. I'll hold that for you while you climb out of the boat and hand it to you once you're in." "That isn't necessary. I can manage." He moved to the edge. How did one get off a boat at sea? Would he have to jump? "Are you sure? Your bag looks heavy. It might weigh you down. When you get closer to the shore, I'll throw it to you." Rather than replying, the man put one leg over the gunwale. The grey water churned below him. He paused, trying to gather the courage to put his other leg over. Too late, he saw the shadow of the captain rushing at him. A grasping hand fastened on the strap across his chest, and the captain tried to yank the bag over his head. The man fought back and managed to land a punch, but he was wobbling half on and half off the boat. His right leg swung free as the two men tussled. The captain gave him a shove. He grappled with thin air. He was falling. He felt a tug, and his bag was ripped away, the bulky contents knocking his head. Icy water closed over him. He'd taken a breath in shock as he entered it, and the painful, stinging saltiness filled his mouth and nose. His body rejecting the sensation, the water splurted out, but instantly his lungs reacted with the impulse to breathe in again. He clamped his lips and tried to ignore the spasms that jerked his ribs. Twisting, flailing, he tried to find the surface. Which way up was he? Where was the sky? He could see nothing. The water was cloudy, opaque. He reached out with his feet, but they didn't make contact. Where was the seabed? More by luck than effort, his head broke the surface. Sweet air. He sucked in a lungful and immediately coughed. He sank below the waves again. But now he knew in which direction lay his survival. Inexpertly kicking, he managed to rise to the surface. His arms windmilled. Was this how to tread water? His chin and mouth barely visible, he strained to see the boat and caught a glimpse of the stern and the engine chugging away from him. The damned captain had taken all he had, the wealth he'd spent his entire life collecting. All that remained was the clothes he was wearing, a photograph, a silver necklace, a ceramic pot of fragrant oil, and the coins he'd sewn into his turnips. But he had worse problems than few funds. Where was the shore? Swinging about, he spotted the beach. It did appear to be deserted, as the captain had promised it would be. He flattened out his body in the water and kicked his legs harder. Tentatively, he moved his arms in a broad breaststroke. That seemed to help keep him afloat, and the waves appeared to be carrying him in the right direction. The person who had been Hans Jonter slowly swam closer to land. He had a new name now, one he'd thought up on his long journey from Jamaica, Joseph Fry. What a name to conjure with, memorable, solid, evocative of the old Britannic Isles. The tip of one of his toes brushed the bottom. He'd made it. He put both his feet down and stood up, the cold water streaming from his sodden clothes. A wave crashed into his back urging him forward. He began to walk the remaining distance to the shingle. He was going to be okay. He was a survivor. And though he might have left his old name behind, he hadn't abandoned his dreams, his vision for the future. He would make the right contacts and establish a network. Then, when he was ready, he would begin again. Chapter 44. Wright stepped between the opening double doors into bright sunshine. He paused a moment, taking in his surroundings. Palm trees lined the quiet street. The sky was a brilliant blue. It had been a long time since he'd been planet-side without being in a combat zone. New Zealand was one of the few remaining places on Earth not currently degraded by resource harvesting or under threat of invasion by the EAC. His time at the psych unit had done him good. Drug therapies, lots of talking, and learning of techniques to help him cope when memories intruded into his mind unbidden. A week seemed too short a time to be there, but he guessed the unit was under pressure to sign off on patients. The Alliance's resources were stretched. Every man and woman was needed. His orders to return to the Gallant had arrived as soon as the doc declared him fit to return to duty. He had a few hours to kill, however, before the transport was due to leave Auckland Military Spaceport. He decided to take a walk around downtown and maybe buy a few souvenirs of his visit. He'd never bothered decorating his cabin, but maybe a picture or two would be nice. He was about to walk away from the unit when someone on the opposite side of the road waved at him. "Hey, Wright!" she called. A car approached. After waiting for it to pass, Taylan Ellis crossed the street. "Phew," she breathed. "I'm glad I caught you. I had to virtually break Colburn's arm before she would tell me where you were, and then she said I'd miss you because you were leaving today." He didn't answer. Encountering her here at the unit, knowing she knew he'd stayed for treatment, made him feel weird. "Is there a bench or somewhere else we can sit?" she asked. Then, before he could say anything, she answered her own question. "Yes, there's one. Come on." The bench stood in a small square of lawn and flower beds to one side of the psych unit entrance, not really large enough to be called a park. As they sat down, she said, "Hi, Taylan. How nice of you to come and see me. How are you?" He smiled. "Sorry, you've taken me by surprise. But how are you?" "Better now I can see you're okay. When you disappeared after the battle, I was worried about you." "Maybe I should have told you where I was going, but I thought you'd be returning planet-side at the first opportunity, and coming here feels a little embarrassing." "Don't be dumb. It means you're human, unlike Brigadier Bitch Colburn or Lieutenant General Carroll the psychopath." He tried to smother a chuckle, but then gave up smothering it and burst out laughing. She smiled. "That's good. I think that's the first time I've heard you laugh properly." "Have you been aboard the Gallant all this time?" he asked. "I have. I received my official discharge, then I kind of hung around under the radar. Things were crazy after we took the Dwyr to the ship, right? I think the Alliance could barely believe its luck. No one was paying any attention to me, so I took the time to sort out some stuff." "What's been happening?" One of the standard rules of treatment at the unit was no access to news. "Did you know Talman's announced he's lending his support to the Alliance?" "I didn't. That's great. We might win this war yet." "Did he say what was behind his decision?" "I don't think he did, or I didn't hear about it anyway." "Oh, And, she added, in the tone of someone about to impart some juicy gossip, the word is Dwyr Orr is in a coma. That's why she was so unresponsive when we found her. The docs can't bring her out of it.
Really?
Yes. In fact, I know it's true because Arthur told me.
You're friends with him again?
Not exactly. I mean, he's come close to killing me twice now, so, you know. But he did seem to want to make it up to me somehow. It's odd. Deep down, he's extremely moral as well as kind and well-meaning. On the other hand, he's also a bloodthirsty, remorseless killer.
But he's only ever like that when Merlin's around, said Wright.
Yes, something comes over him and he does whatever the alien tells him. I'm not certain, but I think the fact that I tried to stop him both times might have made him think twice about Merlin.
That's good news. And what's happening with the EAC?
It's going just as strong as ever. It announced it has a new leader, Dwyr Kala Orr.
The boy.
Yes, Kala's son, Taylan agreed. But we all know he's too young to lead. The real leader is that woman who escaped with him.
I said something similar to Merlin once. I suggested she might be our real enemy, that she'd encouraged the original Dwyr in her ambition to convert the entire globe to her cult.
What did he say?
He said...
Wright scrunched his brow as he tried to remember.
He complimented my insight. That was all, though.
He did? Then maybe you're right. Maybe he was saying you hit the nail on the head.
Maybe, but what good will it do us? He also said she's impossible to kill.
Taylan frowned. Then she appeared to become distracted by something. She was staring at a spot around the top of his head. She reached out a tentative hand and gently pressed the crown of his hair. Doesn't it ever stay down? She was referring to the irrepressible tuft.
Never, he replied. But one day everyone will wear their hair like this.
She snorted with laughter. I expect you're right. When mine grows back, she self-consciously touched the short regrowth on one side of her head. I'm getting it cut just like yours. A plaintive meow came from the bag at her feet. Oh, I almost forgot. Poor Boots, he's been cooped up in there for ages.
You brought the ship's cat to Earth with you?
He was never the ship's cat. He was always my cat. I left him on the Fearless because I couldn't look after him in West BI, but I got a batcher to have him transferred to the Gallant, and now he's yours. You will take care of him, won't you? He's very cuddly when he gets to know you, and he's trying really hard to be house-trained. Wright thought of his sparse cabin.
I'd be honoured.
Taylan grinned. I knew you would say yes. She quickly became serious again. You know what a batcher said once when we were playing Shang-Chi? He said we were like the pieces on the game board, to be defeated and discarded by the people playing the game. They never come to any harm, only us poor pieces. That's how I feel about Merlin and the other alien who's now controlling the EAC. They can't be hurt, but they'll happily see us die to achieve their aims.
What are their aims, I wonder? Wright asked.
I don't know, and I don't know how to find out. She heaved a sigh.
What are you going to do now?
What else can I do? I have to go back to West BI. But I have a new idea to follow up, a different approach to take. I hope I'm right this time.
I hope so too, Taylan.
Thank you. She stood up. I have to catch a flight to Ireland. Take care, Major T.J. Wright. She bent down to kiss his cheek before leaving. The end. This has been The Gallant, Star Legend Book 3, written and narrated by J.J. Green, with help from Welsh language consultant Mike Paddock. For more J.J. Green books, visit jjgreenauthor.com.